The great perennial war between the kingdom and demons by the efforts of one hero ended with the victory of the kingdom, and all the people rejoiced greatly. Everyone in the kingdom welcomed the savior who had ended the war, and his name is Lee Jae-ho. There's a more beautiful description for him as a warrior from another world, or a dragon slayer, or the groom of the abandoned girl from the Duchy of Balasite. The main character is Lady Nadia Balasite, and she became Lee Jae-ho's wife by taking her vows at the temple at the altar and promising to be a faithful and good wife to him. Their marriage was made before Lee Jae-ho became a hero. That's how all the tragedy in the life of the main character started. She is Nadia Balasite, the daughter of a concubine from the Balasite family, or simply a puppet. Each of the aristocrats condemned her, not understanding why you're such useless trash. As she is still in the Duke's family, as only one existence, and Nadia humiliated the dignity of the family. But the protagonist did not even dream that her own father would recognize her. For Nadia was constantly compared to her younger sister, who had been pampered from childhood. The servants, too, treated her with great disdain. But suddenly her father, after some time, approached her and told her that he wanted to entrust her with a very important matter, and the girl took it as a chance to get respect from her cold towards her father. Then he explained that the girl would have to make a marriage, which would help their family a lot. And this marriage was just with Lee Jae-ho. In those days, Lee Jae-ho was a mercenary who was called from another world for the defense of the kingdom, and the speed of his development was so fast that it even frightened everyone else. But Duke Balasite, the father of the protagonist, was sure that if he could bind Lee Jae-ho to his family through the union by his daughter, it would definitely play to his advantage. And since then, the protagonist and her new fiancé have been pawns of the Balasite family. During the wedding ceremony, Nadia Po asked her husband if he was okay with everything that had happened. But he only looked at her silently and ignored her question. Then the girl thought that she must succeed so that no one would dare to ignore her anymore. But even though Lee Jae-ho and Nadia were forced to get married, the girl still had some warm hope that one day they would not be able to live as a normal husband and wife, until she fell into a terrible trap. So she ended up in prison, and the girl begged to be listened to. Not understanding what had happened, she explained that everything that had happened was a huge misunderstanding and told the interlocutor that she could explain everything and just asked to call her fiancé. Then her sister told Nadia that she must not have fully realized the situation she was in. She fake apologized, and said that Lord Lee Jae-ho would never come to her again. The protagonist was madly surprised by such a statement, so she asked her sister what it was all about. But the one calmly explained that from the time when the girl had just married the young man, the situation had changed dramatically, and now he had become the most important person in this country. So the spouse of such a great man could not be someone like the protagonist. It was Karine Balasite, Nadia's half-sister. She smiled wickedly and said there could be no misunderstanding. So apparently this girl had made a mistake when she thought Karine had willingly imprisoned her here. The protagonist lowered her head in horror and still didn't believe it was true and tried to deny it. Her hands were shaking treacherously, and she said that Karine and her father were probably involved in the whole thing. Initially, the protagonist thought that maybe it was because of their feud with Karine's half-sister. But Karina, either confirming or denying her words, simply smiled and inquired, does the protagonist really think that everything was set up by her and her father? Then added that it was an insanely big scandal that had spread throughout the entire socialite society. Then she told about the conversation that happened between Karine, the count, and her fiancé Lee Jae-ho. Then the fiancé explained that there was only one way to make it look like this marriage and everything else didn't happen. At the upcoming banquet, Nadia should be given alcohol. Then Karine explained that normally Nadia is quite cautious about alcohol. That's why they will have to give her some medicine to make her drunk very quickly. Then Lee Jae-ho continued that after that they will put a hired man with her, and when she wakes up she will definitely call people for help. But then there must be witnesses, and the more witnesses the better, and they will be caught together. When the protagonist woke up, she found herself in the arms of a man she didn't know. People around her censured her for behaving insanely indecent and cheating so openly right at the banquet. Some aristocrats laughed and mocked her, as it was immediately obvious that she was the daughter of a concubine, and called her shameless. Karine leaned closer to Nadia and told her that Lord Lee Jae-ho had suggested all this to get rid of her. She wondered if it could be true or just another lie from her half-sister, but then she realized that Lee Jae-ho had never visited her after all that had happened. The main character initially thought that the whole reason was because he was disappointed in her, but in fact he had planned everything on his own, and even marrying her, the daughter of a concubine, must have been a discrimination against him from the beginning. She was unemotional and coldly said that if Lee Jae-ho had just offered her a divorce, she wouldn't have objected. But afterwards she thought that she had always been a simple abandoned nobody. So it was foolish to Hyo-ki that she would have anything with a man who had achieved such heights. But then Karine calmly explained that Lee Jae-ho's reputation would suffer greatly in such a case. After all, he was a war hero. Then the main character laughingly told Karina that apparently she had come because she felt insanely sorry for Lee Jae-ho since he had become a hero, and therefore should be with her. But so simple-mindedly waved her hands and said that the girl could say whatever she wanted, since it was her last chance to speak out anyway. And then smiled and said she had a little while to go, and it would all be over. Then she clapped her hands together. The protagonist was startled and uncomprehending, waiting for Karina's explanation. But she calmly explained that no one would accept a girl who had been abandoned by her husband because of an affair with another man. So no one would want to have a relationship with her in the future. And then she smiled and added that Nadia was also a bastard child, and she would not be able to marry anyone but a simple laborer. So in this case, it is better to die with honor. Then she was horrified to discover that the men who had followed Karine into the room had ropes with them. And as Karine continued, she announced that she was ready to help the girl one last time. The next moment, Nadia was shoved into the wall with great force, pressing her throat with her hand. She didn't know what to do and was still trying to stop the man, who was clearly much stronger than her. But then the two men who entered began to tie ropes around her neck. And at that moment, Karine said that her father wanted to let her stay, but the girl decided to commit suicide because of her feelings of shame. And Lord Lee Jae-ho suddenly lost his wife. The protagonist listened to all this and realized that she wanted to live madly and didn't want to end up like that. Karine, however, calmly watched her sister, who gasped and informed her that in the event of the protagonist's death, their family would be able to defend their honor. She smiled gloatingly and said that only the girl's name would be forever tarnished by her shameless act. The protagonist couldn't breathe. All she could think about was that she didn't want to die like this, not under these conditions. Then Karine went on to say that Nadia would be remembered as a girl who knew shame. The protagonist was panting and in her last minutes of life thinking about doing as her father told her all her life and being insanely obedient as a child. She always watched her stepmother's reactions and couldn't even breathe without her permission. And stepsister always took away her good things in. At the last moment, before the girl lost consciousness forever, Karine came up to her and took her face in her hands and said goodbye to her, saying that she would miss her. In the end, the protagonist died after only 23 years. She thought that this was how her life would end. But at one point she opened her eyes and realized she was back in a day when she was 20 years old. The first thing she did after waking up in her room was to search her body for signs of violent death, but found no rope marks on her neck. She didn't understand how she had survived after all this and wasn't sure she had. She remembered that in that dark room, when her consciousness fogged up, she definitely felt death enveloping her body, but when she woke up, she was perfectly healthy and in her room. And everything looks exactly the same as it did 3 years ago. And that can't be because then it would mean she'd gone back in time. Then she resolutely clenched her fist and decided to take everything calmly and try to analyze and realize that even if everything that had happened was completely unexplainable, it still meant that she had a chance. Remembering Lee Jae-ho's face, she realized that she wanted revenge on her selfish fiancé, and also on her sister who was laughing while she was being killed, and to the father who used it and then disposed of it like a piece of junk. The protagonist would stare worriedly into the void and would clearly be angry at all those people who had made her suffer completely undeservedly. Eventually, she touched her mirror, gazing into her reflection, and realized that if she was given a second chance, she had a few choices. It was to live for love or to live a long life in perfect health. In the end, she was distracted by the voice of the maid, who turned to her and said that if the girl woke up, she should have rung the bell. The maid was clearly unhappy that the protagonist woke up without informing, because of her now she could not clean the room. Looking at her face, Nadia decided that this time she chose revenge. But in the next moment, the maid did not allow close to the protagonist. She pushed the mirror away and told her that if she continued to touch it with her hands, it would definitely have stains on it. Looking at the disgruntled maid, the protagonist reflected that she had just experienced something that many would consider just a dream. But she went back in time because this maid was responsible for the cleanliness of her room, and before Karina killed her 3 years later. But it wasn't just any maid either. On the day of the banquet, when she was captured, she was ordered by Karina to slip her alcohol, which contained a huge dose of medicine, and she did it with a face like she didn't know anything about anything. The behavior of this maid and everything that happened to her was too strange and suspicious to be called a coincidence. At that time, the protagonist did not realize that everything that happened was just a trap, and she was deceived by her own servant. But now everything is completely different, and Nadia is not going to fall into this trap again. Then the protagonist touched the tabletop, which was previously cleaned by the maid. The maid was madly displeased and looked at Nadia, wondering what was wrong with her expression. And did she really want to say something to her? But there she smiled calmly, but there was clearly some passive aggression in her face, after which she calmly thanked the maid for cleaning her room and informed her that they were going out. Ta was madly surprised by such a thing and feels somehow uncomfortable. Even the maid, who didn't know the main character well, felt that the atmosphere had suddenly changed. As soon as the protagonist left her room, she immediately came across a woman who, turning to the lady, informed her that His Majesty the King had come to see the Duke, so she had to prepare for the meeting with His Majesty. The protagonist was surprised by this and did not know how to react to it, and she thought to herself that it was very strange that the king came to her father. But then she calmly looked at the woman from head to toe and said that she had informed her about it just in time. So as soon as she's ready, she'll come right away. The girl greeted her father in the corridor and curtsied respectfully, expecting some further explanation from the Duke. But he only said that she was very late. She gave him an insanely attentive look that was quite serious and informed him that she was going in a huge hurry as it was. When she raised her gaze to the Duke's face, she saw at once that he was looking at her as if she were some lowlife. And in the past, she had really been afraid of that look and had all the time obeyed his every word, trembling with fear. In the end, he calmly turned away from the girl and said that while they were going to the king, he would tell her everything on the way, so the girl should listen very carefully, because it would be about the triumphal ceremony. Nadia was silent and listened without answering. Then the Duke said that the king had come just about the triumphal ceremony, so the protagonist with Karine would have to take care of the tea party, and also the question of who would award Lord Lee Jae-ho with the laurel wreath. So that role falls to Nadia, and she just has to accept it. She did so, not challenging the Duke's words now, but thinking that since the king had come because of the ceremony of triumph, they expected the ancient tradition to be observed in the conduct of the ceremony. The ceremony consisted of all girls of married age placing a laurel wreath on the head of the hero for whom the ceremony was organized. In other words, it is a crazy romantic declaration of love from girls to men. But the problem was that, at this ceremony, one of the people being honored is a northerner, which means he is the worst enemy of the South. The protagonist thought that it was probably because of this that the Duke and the King wanted to shift the focus to something else, allowing her to present the wreath to Lee Jae-ho. And apparently they want to bind Lee Jae-ho to her through marriage like they did in the past. But even if she refused, her father wouldn't listen to her. So she needs another chance to free herself from her father and Lee Jae-ho. They finally reached the door, and soon it opened. Karine was already in the room and looked carefully at the girl who had entered, but afterwards she calmly lowered her gaze and continued to go about her business. The Duke greeted His Majesty the King, and the latter, smiling, said that he was very glad to see him and invited him to sit down, after which the protagonist curtsied and bowed in order to attend the tea party. And at that moment the king said that the Duke must already know why he had come to see him. But he calmly joked that he was not a mind reader, so he should have explained the purpose of his visit. When the protagonist put the cup down, the king's voice was heard, informing the Duke that he shouldn't pretend to be stupid. Then, looking at him more seriously, informed him that the expeditionary force had demanded a triumphal ceremony. Then the king clarified that it was a matter of insane importance. The Duke, calmly sipping his tea, said that the expeditionary force deserved such a ceremony, so the king should do as he asked. But at that moment, His Majesty hit the table with anger, with such force that the teacup that was on the table jumped, and he angrily said that the problem is not only in the ceremony, but in who is in this unit, because it had one of the leaders with the most merit in it, their worst enemy to the north, the Marquis of Winterfell. And at this ceremony, he'll get too much attention, and then the Northerners might think too much of him, so you can't be as quiet about it as the Duke was earlier. But the man calmly explained that the king may not worry about that, as he would shift the focus of the ceremony to something else, and he had a plan for how to bind the hands of the Northmen. The king excitedly inquired what he had in mind the Duke and was fully prepared to dry his supposition. The protagonist, who was cleaning up the spilled tea at the time, thought about the fact that the king had not hesitated and had taken everything her father had said quite seriously, so it was not at all surprising that the Northerners disliked them very much. Then the Duke said that they must bind Glenn in marriage, so the king should use his authority and order him to marry, after which he calmly explained that his bride must be the daughter of a nobleman from the south. Then they could prevent him from uniting with someone from the north. Then the protagonist realized that when she heard that, she remembered the past, namely that after she married Lee Jae-ho, then as a reward for the success of the expedition, the Marquis of Winterfell also got married. And of course his bride was a girl from the family that the Duke had provided to the king, and the king in turn had been advised by the Marquis. Then Nadia thought that, according to rumors, the girl constantly cried because of the cruelty of the Duke, and finally could not withstand such pressure, and ran away from his house. The protagonist was insanely sorry for this girl, who became only a puppet in the plans of her father. But suddenly, she had a sudden thought that she could become that girl, and then she could avoid marrying Lee Jae-ho and also get revenge. But the next moment she paused and ordered herself to think longer about it, for she could not act rashly, and it was too early to talk about it yet. The king listened carefully to Duke Balasite's plan and said that it was a good enough idea, but no one would willingly agree to give him his daughter. But Duke Balasite calmly explained that His Majesty didn't seem to believe in the loyalty of his servants. And after he said that for the sake of the country, people will certainly give up their daughters, the protagonist was madly shocked by this and did not know how to react to it, but then smiled, realizing that this is the chance that she can take in order to avoid the same fate as in her past life. Then the protagonist bowed to the king and asked His Majesty for a little time to speak. He would have been surprised by this display of the girl, but still allowed her to speak. Balazit was simply shocked by such behavior on Nadia's part, and Karine looked at her unhappily and asked her how she dared to interfere in the conversation between His Majesty and their father. But the girl absolutely did not listen to it, and so said that if the king needed a girl who was ready to go to the enemy's camp in the north, she could do it. The Duke was completely shocked by this decision on the girl's part and didn't understand the reasoning behind it. The one looked at him calmly and informed him that she was of the Balazate family, who had served His Majesty all her life, so one of the people most trustworthy of all. Afterward she, bowing down, appealed to the king to allow her to marry the enemy for His Majesty's sake and the welfare of their country. And afterward, she looked confidently at her father and informed him that she no longer intended to be a mere pawn in his hands. At this moment, the Duke looked anxiously at Nadia, who was kneeling before His Majesty, and said that the girl did not seem to understand at all what was in question, for she must not know at all what relations their family had with that of the Marquis. But the king looked closely at the Duke and then at Nadia and said that it was a commendable decision. But as her father had said earlier, their families were sworn enemies, so getting someone else to marry him would be much easier than marrying the girl to him, because the Marquis might not marry her. And afterward he turned to the girl and informed her that she had said earlier that she had a great idea about that. Then she looked excitedly at the king and announced that she would present a laurel wreath to the Marquis of Winterfell at the ceremony. But to this she received only name-calling from her father in the direction of her immediate mind. And afterward he inquired, does the girl expect someone like Winterfell to accept a wreath from her so easily? But the protagonist was not going to give up so easily, so carefully looking at the Count, said that he would definitely accept it, as until now no one has not refused the laurel wreath. But Duke Balicite only excitedly and heavily exhaled from the tension, and informed that such moments should be discussed in advance, not at the last moment, as they had already planned for the girl to hand the wreath to lead Jeho specifically. The protagonist was quite excited, but afterward calmly explained that the Marquis of Winterfell wouldn't turn her down. The king was clearly surprised and encouraged by this behavior of the girl, and the duke was madly angry, wondering why the girl suddenly came to such a conclusion. But she calmly said that she had overheard their conversation while she was making tea, and that the Marquis himself had demanded this ceremony. So the awarding of the wreath is the meaning of this ceremony. But if someone refuses the wreath, the situation changes completely, and all the attention will be on the poor girl who was denied her recognition. And of course, the hero is the one the people love, but the love between the two is much more interesting and exciting. So people will quickly forget about his merits. So he will never in his life decide with his own hands to ruin everything he has been striving for so long. Then she turned to the king and asked if she was wrong. And then she said that this was the reason why he should accept her wreath. The duke entered the conversation, who coldly looked and thought over everything Nadia said, that his majesty can influence that the marquis could not refuse, and then he will have no choice at all. The protagonist looked at her father, agreed with his point of view, and then appealed to the king, informing him that he should insist on the marriage under the pretext of the plea of the official's daughter, and then he, in the eyes of the people, will become a magnanimous ruler who only wants to realize the love of a noble lady. The king thought deeply about it and reported that it was an insanely devious plot, but it looked insanely convincing. And afterward, he looked at the duke and informed him that even in the event that they succeeded, he was a little worried because he had to send the daughter of the Balicite family to the enemy camp. So after looking at the disgruntled duke in front of him, the king asked what he thought of this plan. But he smiled weakly and informed that he had no idea before that his daughter had such a wonderful plan to curb the Northmen. After which he informed that it would be the Marquis of Winterfell who would present the wreath to his daughter at this ceremony. When the royal carriage drove away, the girl found herself in the same room with Karina and the Duke of Balicite, who inquired whether the girl was quite out of her wits. Karine only pompously remarked that she had always known Nadia was devoid of intelligence, but she didn't think she was that stupid. Then Karine looked at Nadia indignantly and wondered if she was going to go to the north willingly, knowing that the north was their worst enemy. But at this point, when Karine asked to cut into the count's conversation and explain how stupid the protagonist was, he ordered her to shut up and informed her that these decisions didn't concern her at all. And then, with an insanely stern and murderous look, he railed at Nadia and ordered her to explain herself, wondering why she was suggesting something like this, for he had made it clear exactly what her role in this ceremony was. So he angrily inquired how the girl had dared to disobey his orders. She looked at him unhappily and thought that even though she had received permission from His Majesty, even so, she would have to convince her father, for otherwise, she would lose again and she must make the right move. So the girl resolutely explained that she had no desire to marry a stranger whose origins were unknown. For though she was only half a noblewoman, she still had Balicite blood in her. Then the duke looked at her unhappily and wondered, does she act so recklessly just because of some unnecessary pride? And now they must give all honor to the Marquis of Winterfell. The protagonist was very excited and ordered herself not to be afraid of his gaze, for she no longer wanted to live as a pawn, so she asked what he meant by honor. After which she informed him, looking intently into his studying gaze, that he would allow the Marquis to experience this honor for only a moment. Then she looked at them calmly and continued more confidently that it was much more important for them to prevent a possible rebellion in the near future. Because of this, the Count was trying to take away the interests of the people at the ceremony. Then he looked at the girl excitedly and asked how she knew. And she only thought that she had hit the right target and thought that the reason why her father reacted in such a way was due to the fact that the imperial family was now a puppet of the Duchy of Balicite, In other words, it was exactly what her father had wanted for so long. The king himself was in his hands, but at the same time he was in a very vulnerable position, and there have been many instances when, in such a violent time as this, the provincial heads of state would plot a rebellion. So the father is worried because this rebellion directly threatens his position. The protagonist realized that in order to somehow deal with this and to fully convince him, she would have to find out what it is that he is afraid of. So she looked at him calmly and told him that even if not at this ceremony, the Northerners will secretly gather, so whoever gets the glory, they should watch them, and this ceremony is the best place for such a thing. And then she gave the example of an animal that first you have to give it water when it is thirsty, and then put a collar around its neck. And as she marries the Marquis of Winterfell, they'll be able to recognize their plans more quickly. And through her sacrifice, they would be able to strengthen their position. So after looking him over carefully, she asked him to let her do something similar for their family. The Duke thoughtfully tapped his finger on the table and pondered that Nadia's words did make sense and that this expedition had not gone as he had expected because of the success of the Northerners. Now they were forced to arrange a whole ceremony. But if Nadia travels north as Winterfell's consort, they can quickly learn of their movements, and it's a good chance to place a spy in his entourage. Then he looked at the girl calmly and informed her that they would do as she wished. Anne Karine was clearly indignant at such an attitude on the part of the Duke towards Nadia. She shouted at her father and asked if he was really willing to give her to the north, and asked how things would go with Lord Lee Jae-ho since he wanted to give the girl to him. But her father only ordered her to be quiet and told her that he could find Lee Jae-ho another bride. The Duke then looked carefully at Nadia in front of him and wondered what she really wanted for her sacrifice, as he knew well that she was definitely not doing it for the Duke or their family. So he was curious to know what the girl wanted for such help. The protagonist thought that so far she had been able to deceive him, so all she had to do was answer his last question correctly. Then she looked at him confidently and told him that she wanted freedom, since one day the Duke would defeat his enemy Winterfell, and then he should let her live as a noble widow. Unmarried girls are discussed by society, but widows and divorcees are not. So even if she doesn't remarry, she doesn't want to carry their family name anymore because she doesn't want to be tied to anyone and wants to live just an ordinary life. She asked the Duke if he could promise her that. He looked at the protagonist and thought for a while. And then, back to her resting place, Nadia reflected on the fact that the deal had gone well, and from the very first day she had gone back in time, she had managed to avoid marriage with Lee Jae-ho. But suddenly, she noticed a showdown between servants and guards at the window. The maid cried and begged to be believed, but the woman only looked at her sternly and ordered her to be silent because the girl had dared to touch her mistress's things. She sobbed as the guards led her out and said that she did not care about the jewelry and had not stolen anything. Then the protagonist remembered slipping her jewelry and realized that Karina's puppet she was also able to kick her out on the first day. And then she thought that since she has already had a chance to live again, she should take advantage of it and cope with all her difficulties by her own efforts. Although so far to revenge, she was still far away, so it is necessary to detail further plans. While the main character was making plans how to destroy the Duchy of Balisset, it was time for the ceremony. Then one of the workers turned to the Marquis of Winterfell and reported that the preparations for the ceremony were complete. He looked at her nobly at him in his fine ceremonial attire, and at that moment the man proceeded to ask the Marquis to lead the troop. Then looking resolutely into the distance, he informed all his subordinates that they could depart. The protagonist at this moment observed a beautiful picture. Flower petals were flying everywhere in honor of congratulating the unit on the victory. As well as watching the soldiers marching in marching formation, people cheered them. As the girl looked at all of this, she realized that everything was happening exactly the same way it had in her previous life. From the clothes and jewelry she was wearing, to the seats each of them was sitting in, the protagonist was looking over a small pendant with bright emeralds in her hands and thought about the fact that if she hadn't had time to intervene, everything would have gone exactly the same way it had in her previous life. The girl looked at Nadia and asked what she was going to do if her pendant cracked. The girl looked at Nadia and inquired what the girl was going to do if a crack appeared on her pendant. and afterward informed her that she had lent her this pendant to her since it was her father's order. But once the ceremony was over, then the girl should put it back. She was clearly unhappy with this statement from Karina, as she had said that Nadia should return the jewelry to her. Only this jewelry belonged to her mother, but she didn't have the energy to answer something like that. So she decided to be patient and thought about the fact that she had always tried to please Karina before. But now she didn't care about her. She would definitely run away from here. But at that moment, she was distracted from Karina's indignation by the Duke, who informed her that a troop would be arriving soon, and ordered Nadia to get ready and sternly told her not to mess up and to hand over the wreath with dignity. The protagonist didn't even look in his direction and just agreed, looking at the people that were entering at that time. Seeing the knights on horseback approaching, the protagonist thought that only one thing had changed from what had happened, because in the ceremony from her past life, she had given the laurel wreath to a completely different hero, and now the culprit was the Marquis of Glen Winterfell. The protagonist looked carefully at the men who entered and saw behind the Marquis Lee Jae-ho, who was getting off his horse. She looked at him carefully and realized that he was supposed to be the hero of this ceremony, her ex-husband. The protagonist was clearly not happy to see him, because although they had not married for love, she felt that there was some kind of connection between them. But she kept coming back to the fact that he had ordered her to get rid of Nadia, and in such a terrible way, by putting her to bed with another man, before giving her alcohol and medicine. The last thing she remembered was Karina's gloating smile when she had told the girl about it and told her that Lee Jae-ho was the one to blame. She admitted to herself that she had a fleeting panic about what had happened, and her heart began to beat very fast. The king raised his sword and informed the knights that for their deeds he would grant them glory. Before him knelt Glen, who told his majesty that this was a great honor for them all. After which the king smiled good-naturedly and said that he had heard that Winterfell's merit had been especially high in this expedition, and so it was a very warm feeling to hear of it. Still bowing his head to the king, Glen Winterfell apologized that the rumors had been exaggerated, but he only laughed, telling the lad to put all modesty aside. He then said that looking at Glen reminded him of the past ruler of Winterfell, as he too had been an outstanding knight. So their loyalty is worthy of praise, and if his father wasn't bedridden and learned of his speed, he would definitely be pleased. Glen was silent. Although the protagonist watched him and knew that the most painful topic for the Marquis of Winterfell is related to his father and the king knew about it, but still spoke up in order to humiliate him. Then the king scrutinized Glen and informed him that they should reward their family for their loyalty, but he calmly replied that all they had to offer was what they knew of their loyalty. The king only calmly walked around him and informed him that young men in their time were very serious. So by order of the king, the official ceremony began, and then the king announced that they were all here today to congratulate the heroes on their victory in the expedition. The greeting of the families began immediately afterwards, and Duke Balasite was the first to meet the Marquis of Glen and then greeted the young Lord of Winterfell. But he calmly replied that he had inherited the title, so now he was Marquis, and if the Duke's memory was already failing him, he had better leave his post and rest well. But the Duke angrily said that he had indeed made a mistake, but that even though he was now a Marquis at such a young age, he still lacked much. But he looked him over from head to toe in a calm and serious manner, and inquired what was not enough for him, for he was a man in the prime of life. Then the Duke smilingly told Glen that he really resembled the former Marquis in his ardor. Then, seeing the displeasure on Glen's face, he said that it was a man who had had an accident and expressed his regret. Then the king announced that it was time to hand over the gifts prepared for the victorious knights. Then the Duke announced that it was time for Nadia to leave, and finally, it was her turn. At this point, the young Marquis of Winterfell reflected that it must be for this reason that the king had so happily agreed to hold the ceremony, for he had decided to change the very essence of the ceremony. And afterwards, he turned to Lee Jae-ho and realized that the owner of that wreath must be him, because anyone knows that the main character's father supports him. So originally, this whole ceremony was meant for only one person, so Glen should just quietly skip it. And then he lowered his gaze, thinking about the fact that the expedition had taken longer than he thought. so he wanted to get this back home as soon as possible, where there was likely a mountain of business piled up. So it would be nice if the king paid them well as a reward. But suddenly he was shocked to see Nadia standing in front of him, looking intently into his face, holding a wreath in front of him. He stared at her, completely uncomprehending as to why the daughter of the Earl of Belicet was standing right in front of him, and perhaps she was overexcited because of the large number of people. Then he gently bowed to her and whispered that the lady had made a mistake due to excitement, then pointed at Li Jiho, who was standing behind his back, and informed her that he was the guy with the black hair that she needed, so she should slowly head in his direction, and everyone would turn a blind eye to her little mistake of excitement. But the girl continued to stand in her place and remain silent. Then Glenn interrogated why she wasn't moving from her seat. She calmly explained that she wasn't mistaken at all. He was quite agitated and covered his face with his hand so that only she could see his expression, and wondered what she meant. Nadia then smiled brightly and told the Marquis of Winterfell that he had been on her mind for a long time, so she asked him to accept her laurel wreath, after which she smiled and told him that she had fallen in love with him at first sight as soon as she saw him. So she immediately felt that he was the right person to take care of her for the rest of their lives. But suddenly Glenn leaned very close to her and said that she apparently didn't know what it meant when an adult girl hands a wreath to a man. The protagonist was still looking into his face, though she was insanely embarrassed, but she kept smiling and thought about how Glenn was much rougher than people said he was. But she couldn't back down. So holding out the wreath, she said that she was fully aware of it, so now she confesses her love to him. Everyone around happily threw up their hands, admiring such courage from the girl, at which time the Duke smiled, and the king, approaching the Marquis, inquired why should the fair lady wait for his answer, and he was too long silent. But he looked at the king worriedly and told his majesty that he did not deserve the wreath, so he could not accept it. The protagonist saw the displeasure on the man's face and admitted to herself that she had expected such a reaction. After all, he was not the kind of man who would accept a laurel wreath so easily. After which she wondered if it would still be profitable for him to marry her. Then she mentally apologized to the guy she'd used and gently took hold of the fabric of his clothes. Then awkwardly informed him that if the young Marquis of Winterfell was worried that she was only the daughter of a concubine, she could just give him the wreath, and then he wouldn't have to worry about her. The protagonist did it as she wished to elicit pity from the people, and it seemed to work wonders. Glenn grudgingly turned on her, wondering why she was saying something like that. At this time, the people around them began to ask why the Marquis could not accept the wreath, and why he was forcing the young lady to dishonor herself so. Some condemned the man for taking out his anger on the young lady because of his disagreement with the Duke, and most of them said that the Marquis of Winterfell needed to accept Lady Belicet's sincere love. He grabbed his blade out of habit, but he realized he couldn't do anything like that and thought that apparently the people around him had just decided to ruin the ceremony with his own hands. Then he snatched the wreath from the girl's hands and informed her that they would have a long conversation, but that they should continue later. Then he headed away. The protagonist looked at him excitedly and realized that she had succeeded in her plan after all, and she was able to change her future. Eventually, the protagonist, along with the Duke and her stepsister, went home, and the Duke, calmly walking to his carriage, praised Nadia for doing well today. Then turned to her and informed her that it was worth it to see the confused face of the Marquis of Winterfell, so he has no choice but to accept the protagonist's offer. She only smiled and told her father that there was no need to thank her, and Corinne was clearly displeased with the Duke's behavior. But suddenly, as the Duke was about to get into the carriage, he was called. When he turned around, he spotted Li Jiho, who grudgingly approached, informing him that they urgently needed to talk to him. The protagonist and Karina stood silently behind the Duke's back, waiting to see what the dialogue would be about. The Duke asked Li Jiho what the reason was for this paid visit, because he must be tired after traveling such a long way, so he should rest. But he said he had to ask the Duke something urgent, and then with a determined fist he said that he had heard that Lady Nadia was to present the wreath to him at today's ceremony, and wondered what had happened and why the plans had changed. The protagonist was feeling rather agitated about everything that had happened, and she didn't understand why his father had told him everything beforehand. Duke Balasite calmly waved his hands and said that it happened, and it was urgent, so he couldn't inform Lee Jae-ho and apologized, then carefully looking at his face, said that he would find him a more suitable match, so he shouldn't be upset. But he was clearly outraged and said that he did not come to the Duke to look for another bride. He really wants to know the answers to his questions, namely why he changed his plans. The Duke only rubbed his head as if from a headache and informed that there was a reason for it, and this was not the place to talk about it at all, so he should come in. But Lee Jae-ho was clearly furious. He was screaming that this was too much, because before he even joined the army, Balahit had promised him. But to this behavior from Lee Jae-ho, Duke couldn't react calmly, so he shouted and asked what he wanted now. After all, the ceremony had already taken place, so nothing could be changed. Lee Jae-ho was clearly displeased, but he realized that Duke Balasite was absolutely right, and there was absolutely nothing that could be changed now. Therefore, he simply remained silent. The next moment, a hand was laid on his shoulder by the Duke, who calmly explained that he was confessing his mistake for not warning him. But he assured that he would solve the problem and the Duke would make it up to him. Then he calmly looked into Lee Jae-ho's eyes and asked if he knew what he was talking about. The man glanced oddly at the hand that rested on his shoulder, but still agreed with him without further argument. The Duke eventually climbed into his carriage and beckoned Nadia and Karina to come in as well. In the end, at the last moment, before climbing into the carriage and leaving, the main character looked at the excited Lee Jae-ho who was standing in front of her, and noticed that he had a strange expression on his face. But afterwards she calmly dismissed these thoughts as foolish, for she no longer cared for him and was not concerned with his problems. After all, the first person who betrayed her was this man. Days later, at Winterfell's mansion, the Marquis sat chatting with his knight. The knight was clearly excited and reported that in the marketplace all but talked about what had happened at the ceremony, because the lady, who was not often seen in public, had confessed her love to him. After which the knight, carefully looking at the Marquis, reported that, as if it was not, he in any case had to react to this one, otherwise he would be forcibly married to her. But Glen Winterfell rubbed his head unhappily as if due to a headache and informed him that it was late enough, whereupon he handed his knight a letter and advised him to read it. He did so at once, and excitedly reading the lines asked, "Is this a letter from the royal family?" But when he reached the end, he was horrified because, veiled though it may be, His Majesty was telling him to marry. Glen clearly was not happy about this and indicated that he had correctly understood the message of the message and stated that if he continued to refuse, they would consider it as disobeying the king's order. The knight was horrified and said that it was absolutely too much and they had no right to act so cruelly. Moreover, if we take for example the same expedition, he absolutely did not argue and immediately agreed to participate in it, so it was unclear that they still want to demand something from him and force him to prove his loyalty. Besides, their army and the lands were steadily paying taxes, but even after that, His Majesty continued to have doubts. But Glen looked at him calmly and told him that Duke Balasith must have told His Majesty about him, and so the Duke would do anything to expose the Winterfells for attempted sedition. Because the northern territory where Winterfell was located was not always part of the kingdom. It was subjugated 100 years ago. The north and south have always differed in culture as well as many other things, and therefore could not easily lie down with each other. The northern army defended the border in the north from monsters, then provided security and fertile south. But southerners look at this and consider northerners as wild and frightening, which was characteristic of those aristocrats. As a result, the previous Marquis and Marquess of Winterfell were involved in an accident due to a conspiracy that was going on behind their backs. As a result of this accident, Glen's father was left bedridden and his mother died. And it was the Duke of Balasith who was more and more suspected of being the culprit. And it was the Duke's daughter who presented the Marquis of Winterfell with the laurel wreath. He then explained to the knight that there were as many as 2 reasons why they might want this marriage to take place. First, to prevent the Northmen from forming an alliance through marriage. And second, to send a spy into the enemy camp. The knight agreed with what he said and said that it was indeed a great way to find out about a possible rebellion before anyone else, after which he brought up Lord Lee Jae-ho and said that according to the people who were at the ceremony, Lady Nadia was supposed to give the wreath to him. And they say that Lee Jae-ho was madly surprised by what happened and didn't know how to react. Glenn was surprised enough to ask, but then the knight explained that Lydia Nadia and Lord Lee Jae-ho had secretly promised to unite hearts and lives, and it seems that the plan concerning Lord Lee Jae-ho had been changed in a hurry, and the Lord had not been told about it at all. Glenn scrutinized the wreath Nadia had presented to him and said that in principle it was quite expected, and he was right that the laurel wreath was not meant for him at all, but for another young man. But afterwards he calmly rose from his seat and said that they would have to do as His Majesty wanted after all. Otherwise they would have excellent reasons to attack them. The knight, though he realized it, still informed that it was the daughter of their enemy after all. The knight, though he realized it, said that she was the daughter of their enemy. But Glenn only smiled calmly and assured that his knight shouldn't worry about it, because no matter how much you look at it, Nadia is only just a duke's beautiful daughter, and she won't be able to do anything in a foreign land without a single ally. The more he doubted that the girl would be able to live at least a week with the cold attitude of the servants, and then he started to leave his room, thinking that it could not be otherwise. Nadia would want to return home, and it would not be his fault, since he had obeyed the king's orders. As a result, the Winterfell and Balasite families were united. The wedding was held on Winterfell territory, and the engagement in the capital, and after they quickly sorted out these minor things, a banquet was held at the Balasite mansion to celebrate the new family. Nobles mocked the main character, not understanding why she married Winterfell, and someone discussed that the girl has no shame or conscience. Father and Christina, it would seem, only enjoyed what was happening, but now for the main character was not the time to pay attention to these people, because she was completely busy with her newly minted fiancé, who clearly was not happy about it. The protagonist held up her hand and suggested that the Marquis go dancing. She knew that no matter how much she didn't like it, now she had to get into the character of a noble woman in love, who burns with love, looking at only one person. Glenn didn't have a chance to refuse, so he decided to dance after all. As they twirled in the dance, the protagonist thought she felt something at the ceremony, and the Marquis of Winterfell became even more wary of the Balasite family. So first the girl needed to show the young man that she was not dangerous to him at all. But suddenly, unexpectedly, he picked her up by the waist and came very close to her, being only 10 centimeters away from her face, and gazing intently into her eyes, and looking at her completely, he asked her what she was thinking about. The protagonist felt some awkwardness, but nevertheless accepted her image of an aristocrat in love and smiled and crossed her fingers and said that she admired the beauty of her fiancé Glenn. The extra looked at her unhappily and informed her that the girl called him by his first name, though they were not close at all, so he asked her to call him Marquis Winterfell from now on. After adopting that remark, the protagonist smiled and told Glenn that she didn't mind at all. He was insanely unhappy, so he opened his fingers in protest at her behavior. Afterwards, he informed her that the girl's smile wouldn't last long. Finally, he looked at Nadia threateningly and said that he wondered how long the girl would be able to smile as brightly in the north, and suggested that she check it out for herself. In the end, he left, leaving his bride alone. Aristocrats, like vultures, began to talk about it at once, pitying the protagonist and not understanding why she fell in love with Severyanin. But it brought only joy to the protagonist, so she smiled with relief and was glad that Glenn finally left, because she could no longer squeeze out that friendly smile and make an image of a fool in love. In the end, pretending that she was madly upset by what was happening, the girl went out to the balcony to be alone, and grudgingly noted that it was insanely difficult, because her whole body was cramping from the fact that she had been forcing herself to smile next to Glenn all day. But suddenly, the protagonist heard a call that called out to her by name. Lee Jae-ho entered the balcony and greeted her. But before she could even think about it, he approached the balcony and explained that he had come because he wanted to ask the protagonist about something. The girl was madly surprised by this, but still decided to give him the right to ask, but in the end added that she had nothing more to say to him. Then the man scrutinized her and wondered if the girl hated being married to him so much. The protagonist was quite surprised by such words from his side, and then the man continued his question and asked that Is it much better for a girl to endure humiliation and slanted glances and go to the very center of the enemy camp than to be with him? The protagonist excitedly gazed into her face, absolutely not understanding why he was saying such things, because from the very beginning it had not been clearly decided that they would get married. At the same time, Lee Ji-ho looked carefully at the girl in front of him and said that the Duke had already told her everything that had happened and that the plans had been changed at her request. But she reacted calmly and said that in that case, she had nothing more to tell him. Lee Ji-ho looked at Nadia more seriously and asked is he not worthy of hearing the truth, and wondered, perhaps it is because he is an outsider or because his origin is unknown. The protagonist was very surprised by this reaction, and scrutinizing him did not understand why he behaves like this, because earlier he was the first to betray her, but she was not going to tolerate such a relationship traitor. So with a resolute clenched fist, she informed him that the man himself was not happy about this marriage. The one looking at her carefully inquired when he had said something like that, or shown it by his actions. But she calmly explained that she wasn't a fool at all, and he had been worried before that the authorities were discriminating against him because of his background, so he wanted to marry a girl from a noble family. But she was just an abandoned girl, so if she was offered to marry Karina, he wouldn't hesitate for a second. When he heard that, he was petrified, as if not imagining how the girl could so clearly understand his plans and thoughts. But he did not say anything. At that moment, the protagonist realized that he could not answer anything, but he doesn't want to lie to her. And then she smiled that Karina's words were true. But it was more of a smile of despair, for this man had been her husband in the past. Then she went to the door and turned around on him one last time and informed him that they were completely unsuited for each other from the start, so she suggested that each of these just go their separate ways. He obviously did not know how to behave and tried to follow the girl in order to stop and continue the conversation, but still did not dare, realizing that for their relationship with Nadia, everything was over. The girl ended up sitting alone in her gazebo feeling rather tired because of everything that had happened, but she was glad that at least in this place she could be alone. She turned around in surprise to see who had arrived, but it was Karine, who approached her and asked if they could talk to her. When Karine approached the protagonist and scrutinized her, Nadia still didn't understand the reason for her visit and decided to ask her what was wrong. The protagonist was clearly not satisfied with the fact that she couldn't even be alone for a minute. Karine jabbed a finger at the girl, informing her that Nadia was following the man around and ruining their reputation with it, so Karine wasn't going to tolerate such a thing. And then she poked her finger into the forehead of the protagonist and explained that she was the true daughter of the family and had a duty to warn the girl, and then smiling gloatingly said that Nadia had been very jealous all her life that her father had only cared for her, and she wanted his attention, so she had gone to such lengths. But then said that no matter how hard the girl tries, she's just a pawn in his hands and nothing more, so she means nothing to the Duke. The protagonist smirked, wondering if she thought she was a pawn, but still agreed. Karina didn't think about it from the other side, because they weren't really that different. Karina was clearly outraged at such a comparison, for how could some illegitimate child equal her as a legitimate heiress? But then the protagonist calmly explained that she didn't succeed in marrying Lee Jae-ho, and so it was her turn. Karine was clearly outraged, so she yanked the girl by her dress and inquired what she was talking about, and went on to say that they were different. After all, she was the daughter of a duchess. But the protagonist smiled calmly and wondered if she still believed her father. After all, his daughter is just a means to an end for him. Karine was outraged by something like this and looked at the main character with fury and feeling insulted. Hose asked how dare Nadia list her to some unworthy like her. But the girl didn't listen to her at all, gazing intently at the necklace that hung around her neck, for it belonged to her mother. Karine threatened that she would tell their father about her words, but there was no response, so she ordered the girl to stop ignoring her. But at some point she smiled wickedly and realized that all the time Nadia had been looking at the jewelry that belonged to her mother. Then she calmly took it off and said that it was the jewelry her mother had gotten from their father, but also calmly explained that Duke Balasite had given something like it to her mother, only because he thought the woman would bear a son. But Nadia had come along, so she didn't deserve something like that. after which Dee held it out toward the girl and asked if she wanted to keep it. And afterwards smiled maliciously and informed her that if she wanted it, she had to get on her knees and beg, and then said that the girl should get on her knees and say, "I'm sorry for being so reckless with you, and I'll never annoy you again." She looked at Nadia confidently, convinced that she would do it. Karine said she was willing to forgive her if she begged convincingly, or if she would just get rid of the jewelry and throw it away. And then she held out her hand with a piece of jewelry over the fence, at the bottom of which was water, and warned that she had many such trinkets, so one piece of jewelry could be thrown away safely, and nothing would change from it. The protagonist was clearly feeling displeased and indignant. And at that moment, Karine looked back at her face, asked if Nadia liked such a suggestion. At this time, Karine swung the jewelry over the water and looked out at the main character, and was getting ready to throw it away. But suddenly, Nadia's alarmed voice sounded, asking her to wait, and wondering if the girl would really give it to her if she knelt down and asked for it. Karine smugly thought that Nadia believed in her words, but happily made sure that she was not going to get anything anyway. So smiling maliciously, she convinced her of her honesty, and herself reflected on the fact that such a quiet girl suddenly starts to show herself and annoy Karine. So Nadia should learn a lesson, because in any case, the jewelry will never be returned to her. And after looking into the protagonist, she ordered her to kneel before her as soon as possible, and if the girl asked nicely, she would be insanely generous. But the next moment, the protagonist just pushed her water away, and Karine flew over the fence and fell there. She looked indignantly at Nadia and wondered if she'd lost her mind and what she was doing. Karina threatened that she wouldn't get away with it, but the protagonist only looked down at her confidently and wondered what would happen if she told her about it. And afterward, holding up the necklace that had belonged to her mother, stated that the girl would not return it anyway, no matter how much she begged. And afterward, she remembered that a similar thing had happened in her past life too, when she had obeyed unquestioningly from Karina, but she had ended up destroying the necklace before her eyes. After the protagonist began to descend the bridge and found herself next to, said that as a child she thought a lot about it and about why Karen has so much hatred for her. And she had always wondered whether she would recognize Nadia as her sister if she did everything she said. But after she realized that the girl hated her for no reason. So now she decided to give the girl a reason to hate her. And this act was the real reason to hate her. Karine watched her in shock, not realizing if the person in front of her was the same person and the same Nadia she had known before. She admitted to herself that she even got goosebumps at the sight of Nadia. After all, she was acting like a completely different person. But suddenly, the other nobleman came running up and inquired if they had heard the screams, and then pointed to Karina, who was lying in the water. She excitedly ran up to her, and as they pulled her out of the pond and covered her with her jacket, asked if the lady was all right. But suddenly the Duke appeared from out of the blue and called out to Nadia and Karina, and angrily asked why they had made such a fuss in the middle of the night. Karine threw herself into her father's arms and said that Nadia was a dirty girl like her, pushing her into the pond. Karine was glad that this would be the end of her annoying older sister. At this moment, the Duke looked calmly at the girl in front of him, wondering if it was true. But Nadia excitedly covered her smile with her hands and said that to Karina, that despite all her hatred, she couldn't lie. And then she let out a fake tear and said that Karine herself didn't listen to her and went to the edge anyway, even though the girl tried to convince her that it was dangerous. And the protagonist was just trying to get her out of there. After, the protagonist looked worriedly at her younger sister and wondered if the girl was worried that she would be thought of badly, but then said that her lies disgraced their family much more. Karine literally went mad with rage and wondered if she was the one the protagonist thought was lying. Then she blurted out that it happened when she threatened her with her mother's necklace, and then she pushed her into the water. But no sooner had she finished than the aristocrat's discussion of her words and threats against her sister suddenly broke out. All at once they clustered together and began to speculate about the fact that the younger sister had threatened the necklace of the protagonist's mother. And apparently the younger daughter has a bad temper. And others wondered why the first daughter's mother's heirloom was in the second daughter's possession. and resented the fact that in the Duchy of Balasit Karina was more beloved. The girl realized that she had said too much and tried to refute all her words, but her father's heavy hand was on her shoulder, and he looked at her and ordered her to shut up, and told her that she was very cold, so she should go back to her room and rest before she caught a cold. But Karine excitedly grabbed her father's hand and informed him that it was very unfair and asked him to listen to her. But the man only yelled that she was behaving inappropriately and ordered her to be taken to her room. Whereupon the Duke of Balasit bowed before his guests and informed them that there had been a little quarrel between the sisters, and he was sorry that it had happened on such a bright day. The aristocrats leaving still kept chatting about the fact that the noble daughter of Balasit had so dishonored their family, and some suspected it would happen someday. The protagonist only wondered if Karine would behave calmly enough for a while. And afterwards, she thought that her father didn't take her side, contrary to what the protagonist expected. She thought that she didn't even expect that for her own father, her honor would be important, even though she had lived with them for 20 years. She smiled and decided that it didn't really matter to her who was sticking up for her, because the important thing was that she had managed to get back the necklace that had belonged to her mother, and now she could leave this unfortunate place in peace. Eventually, she traveled with her husband to the lands of Winterfell and were now in the woods near their estate. Glenn rode ahead of them, followed by the other men who accompanied the carriage and the dowry of the protagonist. But suddenly, a knight rode up and called out to the lord. The latter was obviously displeased, so he said that there was too much noise coming from him, so he ordered him to go back to his seat. Fabian asked him not to be so angry and informed him that he was going to say just a few words and then go back. Whereupon he drew his horse nearer and informed him that it would be a figurative question, but he was still interested in getting an answer to it. Coming close enough to Glenn, he inquired, "Does the Marquis really disbelieve in the confession of the lady, as well as in her sincerity?" Glenn was very offended by such a question, so he shoved Fabian in the side, and he almost fell off his horse, causing him to scream. Glenn gave him a mad, furious, and disgruntled look and told him that if he was going to keep saying such stupid things, he should get out of here as soon as possible. But he calmly informed that he realized that the girl was most likely deceiving him. But just looking at her face during the ceremony and her confession, it did seem to him that the girl was acting quite sincere, and he's not really sure what she was playing at that point. But Glenn calmly turned to him and asked Fabian not to trust Nadia's appearance, for no matter how sweetly beautiful and perfectly fine the girl was, she was still the daughter of the Duke, and she could plunge a knife into his back and the backs of any of their family at any moment. But then Glenn asked the knight to look at the dowry she was carrying and informed what such a dowry is really meant to help their family in times of need, though there is another option and she may be planning to keep an eye on them. Fabian agreed grudgingly and said that seemed like a sensible enough thought. Then Glenn said that if Fabian understood everything, he should go back to his seat, since he was Nadia's guardian and should be near her. He nodded grudgingly, then dismounted his horse and agreed with the master. Eventually, he equaled Nadia's carriage and drove rather carefully and grudgingly. He thought about walking beside Nadia, and after what he had heard from the Marquis of Winterfell, it bothered him even more. But the protagonist, as soon as he saw it, excitedly called, which very much frightened the young man, and said that she wanted to talk to him, but he disappeared, so she had to wait a little. He waved his hands in excitement and said that he had a little business to attend to, but it's all taken care of now. The protagonist smiled radiantly and wondered if it was true that he had been appointed her personal guardian and inquired about his name. He rubbed his neck awkwardly and said that his name was Fabian Knox, but the protagonist just smiled and said that he had an insanely beautiful name. He looked away awkwardly, grateful for the compliment, and wanted to continue driving in silence. But suddenly, the voice of the protagonist came out of Fabian's mouth and said that the man was clearly uncomfortable being around her, but she reassured him that she understood his attitude, because everyone knows that the Balasite and Winterfell families are enemies. But then she got serious and looked at Fabian and said that soon they would all realize that her feelings for the Marquis were actually true. He remembered the words of the Marquis of Winterfell, who had ordered him not to trust her appearance. But the next moment, The same picture swam and then completely forgot about Glenn's warning and reassured the protagonist by informing her that he was actually insanely shy, and afterward inquired in a friendly manner if it was the girl's first time in the North and suggested that she tell her more about these parts while they were on their way. She smiled happily and thanked Fabian for his kindness and said that she was indeed a little bored with the ride. The protagonist was greatly relieved and thought that she had managed to break through the younger knight's barrier. A little more time passed, and the protagonist was already sitting quietly in her carriage alone and resting. But at some moment there was a knock at the window, and behind it was Fabian, who told the lady that she should not be long out of her carriage. She immediately looked out of it and saw that Winterfell Mansion was in front of them. In the end, she settled in a little, and preparations for the wedding ceremony were already underway. Although the protagonist knew that the preparation for the wedding ceremony is in a hurry, but did not expect this at all. The maids told Nadia that it was the wedding dress that Glenn's mother had brought with her, and since the wedding was not long away, it was decided to choose it. And afterward they told a reason, which was that there was an influx of monsters in the North right now, and a bad harvest season, so the people were not in the best position. Because of this, a modest wedding ceremony was planned. And of course, it's a once-in-a-lifetime thing with you, but still she would have to put up with it. But the girl smiled calmly and informed that she understood and didn't have any difficulty about it. The maid was evidently surprised at this attitude on Nadia's part and interrogated what she meant. At this point, the main character offered her hands to her heart and smiled and said that she did not care how fancy their wedding would be, because the main thing is that her fiancé is her beloved Glenn. And besides, now she was a marquess, so she had to think of her people. Upon hearing such a thing, the woman entered and was overjoyed and crossed her arms over her chest and informed her that if she really thought so, she would now be tranquil, and informed her that she really hoped Nadia would continue to think that way all the time. The girl was clearly surprised to see Mistress Grace ground. This is Glenn Winterfell's aunt, since the previous marquess has already died, and the previous marquess is bedridden. This woman is now the eldest mistress in the manor. Then Grace looked at the girl and said that the dress fit her perfectly, and said embarrassed that when Glenn saw it, she'd probably go crazy. Nadia smiled happily and thanked her mistress for such a compliment, and expressed her hope at just such a reaction from Glenn. Suddenly, Mistress approached and took the girl by the hair and looked at her carefully, saying that apparently because of the father of the main character, Glenn is very rude to her, but then smiled kindly at her and looked into her eyes, saying that she should not worry because the girl was insanely beautiful and in time Glenn will open his heart to her. And then the lady said that she was going to help Nadia, so she didn't have to worry about anything and could only focus on unlocking Glenn's soul. The protagonist was embarrassed to realize that she had realized what Mistress Grace had really meant by those words, and knew full well that Glenn still hadn't acknowledged her. But she smiled, thanking her for such advice, and promised that she would remember and use it. Then Grace said that it was time for her to leave, but at the end she smiled and asked if the protagonist knew what was the most important thing in seduction, and advised her to be well prepared for such a thing. The protagonist was clearly shocked by this because she had completely forgotten about her wedding night. She stood alone in her room and realized that she had previously expected that the young man would not even want to touch her, so would refuse to spend the night together. But what if this man decided to spend the night together? After the conversation with Mrs. Grace, the girl constantly thought about what was said, but eventually the very moment of the bride's exit has come, and the protagonist excitedly looking in front of her, thinking about the fact that she cannot get out of her head the thought that she will have to sleep with Glenn. Eventually, they were already standing near the marriage altar, and in front of her was a handsome, white-clad man. But the girl was also beautiful, and eventually the priest asked if the bride and groom were ready to make their vows. But the girl at this time was still busy thinking about would they really be sharing their room after the wedding ceremony. At this point, the priest turned to the man and asked if the bridegroom Glenn was ready to take Nadia Balasite as his wife and swore to love her forever. He answered without hesitation that he was ready. Then the priest turned to the bride Nadia and asked if she would take Glenn of Winterfell as her husband, but the girl didn't even hear the question, as she wondered if Glenn would want to spend the night with her if he hated her so much. But if he did, she didn't know what to do, because she hadn't expected this to happen at all. Eventually, the excited girl was called by the priest to make her vow as a bride that she really wanted to marry the young man. And the girl herself seemed to be frantically excited about it, as she was completely preoccupied with her thoughts. And she just shouted out her consent sharply. The next moment, the priest said that they could seal their vows with a kiss. And then the guy approached and took her face, and then leaned closer to her and began to scrutinize her and was about to kiss her. But the protagonist just thought about the fact that because of the fact that she was always worried about the first wedding night, she completely forgot about the moment with their first kiss. But afterwards, she realized that they just had to pretend to kiss because they didn't need to kiss. And in that case, even if the kiss wasn't real, there was no need to worry about living together. But to her great shock, it seems, the groom was of a completely different opinion and really kissed the girl, and she was really shocked, something like that. After which the priest seems to be completely oblivious to the shocked protagonist, informed the young couple that he was pronouncing them husband and wife, and the girl was only in shock, not realizing whether her fiancé had really just decided to kiss her. As a result, it was soon evening, and the excited girl couldn't find a place to sit and kept pacing back and forth in her room, back and forth, and did not understand what she should do, because she was about to run out of time, because Glenn was going to come. Afterward, remembering their kisses at the wedding, at Nadia's wedding, made her wonder. The guy had really, truly kissed her, which she still found hard to believe, after which she wondered if they would really have to sleep together. The next moment, interrupting all the reasoning in the room, Glenn appeared, and opening the door to the room abruptly, looked back at Nadia displeased. Of course, the girl took her usual image and, smiling at him, pretended to be insanely happy to see him, after which she started excitedly reasoning that she didn't expect the guy to actually come at all. And so, with his appearance, she absolutely didn't know what to do. After which she informed with a smile that she had been waiting for him. But she herself was constantly pondering what she should do. After all, she didn't want to run away anymore and wanted a quiet life. But Glenn shockingly informed her that the girl should not be misguided. After which, addressing her by name, informed her that they would not have contacted the Duke's daughter for anything. And angrily, leaning over her, gazing intently into her face, Glenn informed her that he had come only to tell her in person. And then he quickly turned around and started to leave the room. The main character only asked him to wait. After all, she absolutely did not understand the situation. But of course, Glenn absolutely did not listen to her, so only with anger loudly closed the door behind him. In the end, when he came out the door, only the maids were left, and the protagonist began to cry bitterly and pretended not to understand why her fiancé did this to her, because her feelings for him were really sincere. And I asked him, at him, speaking with emptiness, why isn't he so cruel? That after she exhaled and finished crying, as she had already produced the requisite feeling of abandonment. So Nadia thought about the fact that it was actually a huge relief for her, since she didn't have to sleep with her fiancé, who she didn't really feel anything for. Then, rising from her seat, she thought that she had been insanely lucky this time, and mentally asked that Glenn's opinion of her never change and that this situation never arise again. Then, rising and walking a little through the room, she noticed that a small table had been set for them, as for newlyweds. There was a small table set up, where there was delicious wine, as well as appetizers. So, looking at it all, the girl remembered that she had not eaten anything yet today, and began to taste everything happily and wondered how good the food was, because the wine was really excellent and the beef was exactly as she liked. Then, after a while, when the girl was finally full, she lay back on her bed and thought rather reflectively that it wasn't as bad as she had expected, and realized that it was much better, since she no longer had anything to worry about. After which she lay on her side and began to peacefully fall asleep, and succumbed to the lure of her soft bed. And that's how her wedding night went. In the morning, all the maids were already chatting and discussing what had happened last night and talking about the fact that their master had left the room immediately, not even after 5 minutes, and was mad for some reason. and the other maid just said that she had bet earlier that Glenn would not show up in the room at all. Then one maid smiled happily and asked the others what could have really happened there. But flustered, the girl only calmly reported that most likely they just had a fight, and perhaps for this reason Glenn got angry. After which, the girl, smiling, said that probably now Mrs. Nadia was insanely ashamed. But one of the maids that listened to all this only smiled and awkwardly reported that most likely she is not ashamed, but insanely sad. After all, she last night heard the protagonist madly crying for a long time, but it seems on such words of the girl absolutely no one believed. Then she awkwardly reported that in fact, according to one of her personal maids, the mistress the girl looked like an unrequitedly in love girl who had been rejected, and therefore could not calm down in any way, and was constantly crying while her personal maid tried to calm him down. At this moment, the other two maids awkwardly looked at each other and were madly surprised, after which the pink-haired girl said that she had previously suspected that Madame Nadia would behave arrogantly, but that was not the case at all, which surprised her greatly. Behind it all, Glenn, Fabian, and another knight watched awkwardly, who were madly displeased with the talk that was going on among the maids, after which one of the guards reported that Glenn should have made their maids not to socialize about such things. Fabian awkwardly reported that he should do so by any means possible. After all, it would be unpleasant for his spouse. But Glenn was only cold. Glenn looked them over and told them that they needn't worry about such things, then asked if the boys expected the people in this house to ever be able to love his wife. Then, walking away, Glenn, walking ahead, asked his knights what Nadia was doing now, and one of them calmly said that the girl had officially become a marquess, and so now she had to take care of the household. On hearing this, Glenn turned fearfully to his knight and inquired if the girl was so soon had already begun to spy on them fully, whereupon he called sharply to Fabian and ordered him that he, as her personal guard, should to follow her. The boy only asked excitedly if he was sure he was supposed to do something like that. But Glenn calmly informed him that it was his job to keep an eye on the main character to make sure she didn't do anything suspicious. Also representing Nadia, he informed that Fabian should pay special attention that the protagonist should not send letters to the parental home. Therefore, he had to always stay by her side and report everything to him. Then, after some time, Fabian, at the behest of Glenn, still came to the protagonist, and she excitedly looked at him, wondering if the young man came to guard her, and the boy only smiled awkwardly to convince her of that, and promised that from now on he would try to take care of the mistress. Looking around at such an excited Fabian, the girl only thought that in all likelihood his boss, that is, her current spouse, had gotten mad at her for some reason, and so had decided to send a stakeout. But after the girl, as her image was examined, she smiled happily and informed Fabian that she was insanely happy about such news. After all, it meant that her dear spouse was madly worried about her, and apparently he had thought about the fact that Nadia would feel uncomfortable with strangers. It was for this reason that he sent Fabian, after which admiringly informed her that she had the best spouse. Fabian only smiled awkwardly and agreed with her words. Then he thought that he had not come here to guard her, but to follow her, and he was ashamed of himself, for Nadia had been so pleased when he'd gotten it all wrong. At this moment, smiling, Fabian informed her that in that case, while the girl didn't need him, he would be outside her door, so she could call for him at any time, and asked Nadia to go about her business quietly and not worry about anything. She only waved happily at him and thanked him. Then, still with her angelic smile, she began to think about what, apparently, Glenn had sent Fabian to watch her all day long, and she realized at once that she would have to convince the young man by any means necessary that she was not going to spy at all. Afterward, left alone with the butler, Nadia asked him if he could fetch her the household book, and he bowed to her cheerfully and agreed. In the end, after some time, the main character, literally shaking hands, read this book and absolutely did not believe in what is seen there, so somehow tried to gather inner strength. After which she looked at the butler carefully, shocked. She wondered why they had so much debt. after which she thought to herself that she knew even in her past life that the environment in Winterfell was not good, that she didn't even expect to see such a huge amount of debt. But then the butler calmly explained that it was a peculiarity of the North, where their land was located, because every few years they were attacked by a wave of monsters. And because of that, their family's land was insanely depleted, so resources were insanely scarce, and there were no attractions, so there was no influx of tourists, and therefore no money coming into their region. But Nadia only looked at the butler in all seriousness and asked if they had received any rewards from the king for killing the monsters every year. And she asked what the money was used for. But the butler seriously looked at the protagonist, said that they were able to survive until today only thanks to that money. And in addition, recently the Marquis took part in the expedition. On hearing this, Nadia only rubbed her head tiredly, after which she informed him that for that reason they should not have taken part in any more expeditions, and grudgingly confessed that she had not even known that war required so much expense. But at this point, the butler reported that they had not intended to take part in this expedition. The butler immediately covered his mouth in horror, realizing that he had said something unnecessary. The butler immediately covered his mouth in horror, realizing that he had said too much. But the protagonist took it calmly and only wondered with some sadness if he meant her father by someone. The butler, only looking into her calm face, he began to apologize for such a thing. But the protagonist didn't seem to care at all, as she leaned back in her chair and thought about the fact that she had already prepared a plan on how she could make money anyway. But she didn't even realize that the equal sum of debt was so big. So she wondered how the Marquis of Winterfell had paid off his debts in his past life. But then Nadia was approached by an agitated butler who told her that he had a good solution to the problem. He then asked if Nadia considered herself part of the Winterfell family. And when she confirmed his hunch, the man informed her as calmly as possible that he wanted to let her know directly, for these were rather difficult times for her new family. And he informed her that if the girl used her dowry to pay off the debt, it would help her new family immensely. The protagonist, after looking him over carefully, immediately realized the reason why the butler was so easy. Gave her the seal as well as the key to the safe, for, in all likelihood, on from the very beginning, wanted to ask her for a solution to all their financial problems. Then the butler awkwardly, smiling, informed her that if Nadia could help them solve their debts, the Marquis would be delighted. But the protagonist only calmly turned away and informed her that it was not appropriate to do so. The butler immediately excitedly asked her to think again, but the protagonist still just as calmly informed that she was not saying that because she did not want to help the Winterfell family, but the butler. It was worth thinking for themselves about what awaits them in the future. After all, looking at the expense book, it was obvious that every year their debt was slowly growing, and the early butler himself reported that the reason was the peculiarities of the North, so her dowry would not solve this issue in the long run, and would only help this year, but not next year after all. The debt would reappear and grow again. Upon hearing this, butler was insanely shocked and reported that he hadn't thought of it in that way, but thought that the situation for their lands was literally hopeless right now. But at this point, seeing that the butler was already starting to drift off into despair, the protagonist resolutely rose from her seat and said that this was exactly the kind of case where they should first consider fixing the features of their territory. Butler was flustered looking at such an inspired girl and didn't know how to react, and wondered what she meant by something like that. And she started to explain. In the end, it was all perfectly audible. Fabian, who was outside the door and seemed to be as surprised as the butler, and then reported it all to his boss. In the end, when he told all this to Glenn, he looked excitedly at his knight and asked if the girl refused to use at least a coin from her dowry. But Fabian calmly explained that the protagonist had said no such thing at all, after which he explained that her position was that it was better to begin to increase her dowry than to pay off the debt with it now. But at that moment the other knights came up to them, who looked closely at the young man and wondered if he really believed in such tales told on Nadia. After all, she only seemed good. The renewed Fabian only wondered if they really thought so badly of her. Afterwards, a disgruntled young reported that however the girl could not have been good, as she reported that she did not want to give her dowry, but sad Fabian reported that the girl did look insanely serious when she talked about the land's financial situation. The next moment, clasping Fabian, he began to be mocked a bit by the senior knights, and one of them looked at the Marquis unhappily and wondered if he really wanted to entrust tracking to someone as stupid as Fabian. Looking around at the whole scene, the disgruntled Marquis informed his knights that they had to return to their seats, as there was too much noise from them. Bottom line, Nadia calmly strolled around the house and, looking all around her, realized that she still had an insane amount of things to do, because she needed to make this house really comfortable to live in. But for that first, it was necessary to solve the financial problems that her family had. But suddenly there was a scream from the lower floors, to which the girls simply could not ignore, and excitedly looked in that direction, wondering what had happened there. In the meantime, people shouted at the butler and asked how long they could wait for their money. And the agitated man only tried to explain to them as calmly as possible that they should listen to him, and it was necessary to calm down before talking. But at that moment, the girl excitedly went down to the butler to help him, and, looking resolutely at the people who had come, inquired what had happened between them. But looking at her, the disgruntled people only wondered if she was the Duke's daughter. Hearing this, Nadia was madly displeased, and said that from now on people should have called her the Marquis of Winterfell. At this point, they apologized. The man informed her that he would like to introduce himself to her and gave his name. His name was Sherlock. Then, the other man that stood a little behind informed that he was Wayne from the Northern Traders Alliance. And last was the girl Katharina, who was from a trading firm. But the protagonist only awkwardly waved her hand and asked them to dispense with the unnecessary formalities, and wondered what they were talking about when she distracted them. After clearing her throat a little, Sherlock spoke to her, asking the lady if she would return their money, for the day of repayment of the funds lent by the Marquis was soon to come. She was literally shocked, and the butler only stood behind her, seemingly burning with either despair or shame. And at that moment, looking into her shocked face, Sherlock reported that earlier, information had reached him that Nadia had brought with her an impressive dowry, and if she said she couldn't repay her debts this time, they would take back the wind-shadowed plane that had been left as collateral. Hearing this, Nadia was truly shocked, for this was the only fertile land in the Marquis' possession, and the rest of the land besides this plane was an insanely depleted area. Then the protagonist, literally losing consciousness, remembered how in her past life the Marquis was able to pay off his debts because he simply gave these lands to them. But then, sitting down on the floor, Nadia had inquired of the butler as to when the due date of the debt was due. He calmly informed her that they had 3 more months. Upon hearing this, Nadia immediately thought about the fact that if the plane was taken away, the Winterfell family would be completely impoverished. And even though her husband had a powerful army, if he didn't have the finances, he simply couldn't become the head that would unite the North. Then the girl realized that she had to act decisively, and rising from her seat, she asked of the people who had come that they should give her 2 months. And if they would postpone the debt repayment for another 2 months, she would be able to solve this issue. But at that moment, a flustered Sherlock spoke to her and informed her that he absolutely did not understand Nadia's behavior, because they knew that she had brought a huge dowry with her and did not understand why 2 more months were needed. But Nadia only smiled and said that she actually wanted to use her dowry for business. She wanted to use her dowry for business, to make money, and then she would pay them back. When they heard this, all the people who came seemed to be madly displeased with this information, and absolutely did not believe in the success of this business. Then Sherlock asked her what she meant, and whether she was going to go into such a foolish business instead of paying off her debts. But she only calmly informed them that the Winterfell family was insanely connected to the traders from the northern regions, and informed them that it would be nice if they would consider a long-standing friendship with their family and help in creating a better future for Winterfell. Then she looked at each of them carefully and told them that if they would help her in this way, she would never forget it. And of course, if the business failed, they would take the land they had pledged. Eventually, the merchants looked around and started discussing the protagonist's offer, and realized that basically based on Nadia's offer, they had absolutely nothing to lose. After which they thought to themselves that it seemed to them that perhaps something like this was worth another 2 months of waiting. But then, interrupting their musings with a clap of his hands, Sherlock smiled brightly and informed them that this was exactly the decision the wise Marquis had expected. Then informed that he was ready to give her an answer right now, but he needed to discuss it with the other merchants and inquired if Nadia was willing to wait a bit. But she calmly informed him that she was willing to wait as long as it took. Then bowing, Sherlock thanked her for it and informed her that he would be sure to give her an answer if anything changed. And he only gloated that Nadia was madly stupid, and the business of a girl who had lived her whole life without knowing trouble could not succeed. So as he walked away, he already thought that while the others waited, he would take possession of the best land, and he would become the richest and most successful merchant. When they left, the excited butler, turning to Nadia, inquired what business she had previously spoken of and informed her that the loss of the plane would indeed be colossal to them. But the girl only smiled and informed them that they would in fact return their money as previously planned. The agitated man then asked why the girl had given them extra time in that case. But she then calmly informed him that this was exactly what she wanted to discuss with the butler. Then, going up the stairs, she asked him to invite to the mansion those who wanted to postpone the day of the debt repayment, as she would need to buy something from them. The butler, only madly surprised, inquired what she meant. But the main character, climbing the stairs, reminded that she was going to open a business, and then said that not everyone can do really important business. And then, turning to him and smiling happily, she added that they must show that they would get the person who was really loyal and trusted them and was willing to wait. Eventually, after some time, the protagonist gathered the two merchants in one office, and the men looked at her excitedly, wondering if the business she was talking about was creating herbal tea from thorny vines. But the protagonist just smiled calmly and said that it was exactly what she wanted. She was absolutely sure of her success. But when the merchant heard about it, he only thought about what she was saying, which was nonsense. For they knew very well that prickly vine was a weed that was only taken by the poor and had absolutely no value, so it was just a common weed. At this point, smiling brightly, the protagonist asked if they could buy such herbs for her in bulk. Looking at such a self-satisfied Nadia, the merchants only wondered if she considered such an approach as business. Then the excited merchant sipped his tea. He informed her that the price of this herb was quite low, but if she really wanted to buy in market quantities, she would need some capital and asked how much the girl was going to invest. But then she said with a smile that she planned to use all her dowry for this, and hearing this, the merchant just couldn't stand it and choked on his tea and wondered what in all likelihood this Marquise was really thinking about buying weeds with all her money. Then looking around, he thought that the girl would have been better off buying a dress and jewelry with the money. After all, it could at least be resold. Then looking at the butler, I was surprised that he didn't discourage her from this failure at all. He looked as if he had given up long ago. After that, the merchant himself thought that when Nadia was so confident, especially the last time she talked about it, he thought that she really had a good business plan, but he couldn't even guess that the new Marquis was so unreasonable. But at that moment, another girl spoke to her, who inquired whether she was sure of her decision and reported that according to her, such a business is not the best option. And the protagonist only excitedly inquired what she meant. And at this point, the woman admitted that the thorny vine had absolutely no value, as there were many other good herbs that could easily replace it. And besides, if the costs of transportation and storage were taken into account, they would suffer huge losses. At the protagonist, putting the cup on the table and looking them over seriously, informed them that it seemed that the traders had misunderstood her a little, so they were mistaken. After which she added that she had not invited them to lead the discussion, but to employ them. And she's willing to pay them more than usual, so they will definitely not make a loss. When she heard about it, the merchants looked at each other, then exhaled and realized that the girl could not be persuaded and agreed. After that, the man said that if she was so confident, he was ready to contact all the trading firms on the continent and was sure that there would be no problems with providing the necessary amount of goods. Hearing about it, the protagonist smiled happily and said that she had great hopes for these people and asked them to take care of everything without exception. Eventually, after a while, A conversation took place between Glenn and his aunt, and the agitated woman wondered why Glenn's spouse still didn't take care of anything but her own useless weed, and wondered if this was how men were going to watch his wife engage in this kind of wasteful spending. But Glenn calmly minded his own business and said that his wife had started this business with her own money from her dowry, so he simply had no right to interfere with her. After looking at him unhappily, the aunt informed him that his wife had absolutely no financial literacy, since she believed that some herb would bring her money. She asked how she was going to run their household. Then, looking carefully at her nephew, she reminded him that the debt repayment day was coming up. Hearing this, Glenn only turned quietly, addressed her by name. His aunt, seeing such a stern look, immediately got up from her seat and said that she couldn't watch her tongue. But after a careful look at her nephew, she told him that although she had said something that might have been unpleasant for him, she had only told him because she was not worried about the future of the family. In the end, when his aunt left, Glenn thought sadly that the day of repayment of the debts was very near, and he did not want to give up the only fertile land she had in his possession. But eventually, a worried butler burst into the room, asking if his master had heard about the recent news, and I think the woman looked really excited. Then, approaching Glenn, he smiled happily and said that they were saved and he would not have to give up the plane, and it was all thanks to the lady. When the man heard about it, he was really shocked and couldn't believe what he heard, because to him it sounded like some crazy bad joke. But recently, in a village in the south, an unknown disease began to spread, and the people who were sick with it had a tremendous fever. Then slowly their limbs began to darken and turn purple-red. The people around, only sadly watching this picture, talked about who else had time to catch the plague, but his interlocutor only calmly said that recently this disease has become insanely widespread. And remembering what had happened earlier, said that for the past few months they had not even had a day when they had not burned a corpse. And not only their village was suffering, but all the lands in the kingdom, starting from the southern territories. But suddenly, an excited young man ran up to the speaker, who, out of breath from running so long, said that the news had come in that a cure for the plague had finally been found, and it was a tea made of thorny vines. When the merchants heard the news, they immediately decided to buy the thorny vines, but someone unknown had already bought it, and Fabian was happy to help with this, and by collecting money gave the residents their well-deserved thorny vine. All the residents who received this herb were overjoyed. Then they smilingly reported their worries that their relatives might die, and were madly happy that these people were selling weed so cheaply. The young man only smiled brightly and said that she should not thank him, because all this was possible only thanks to the generous Marquise, and she made sure that everyone could be cured. Then the decree was issued to start supplying herbal tea at an affordable price, and to start from the district where the situation was serious. And overpricing or resale, as well as the storage of grass, were prohibited, and all this was done to reduce losses among the poor. In the end, the agitated merchant said to the protagonist that he was worried that the Southern Territory would think that they had monopolized all the medicines in the North so that they could have an epidemic. But when she heard about it, the girl only smiled and said that the probability of this is quite high, because in the first place, it was not Winterfell bought up all the barbed wire, but ordinary merchants to whom she turned. Then she smiled and looked confidently at the merchant and wondered if he had forgotten who she really was. She was the daughter of a duke from the south. After which Nadia reflected that, as expected, the spiny vine grass had been sold, but it proved to be faster than all her expectations. And because of this, the merchants who agreed to wait and help the girl in business got a great deal of profit, as well as a good payout. And in the end, they stood with the statements to settle debts with the Winterfell family. In the end, they owed the girl 97200 gold coins, and that was the end of all debt relations between Winterfell and the trading firm, and the man their family owed 10000 gold coins. Then a worried Sherlock, looking at the situation, couldn't believe that Nadia had managed to repay all her debts, and moreover that she had only offered to cooperate with those who agreed to wait for her, and was mad about it. But at that moment, seeing his anger, he was approached by Nadia, who asked if he was all right, because he looked quite worried. Then she said with a sly smile that he didn't seem to be having a very good conversation with the other merchants, although she expected a letter from him, And at that moment, Sherlock realized that the girl was actually just checking up on them. And then Nadia smiled and said that now that she had paid off all her debts, she would like to ask only those people who had helped her with her business to stay, and ask the others to leave quickly. After that, not without attention to Sherlock and his insanely angry face, she said that she would definitely wait for the day when she could meet him again. Sherlock only grudgingly announced that he would also be waiting for them to meet. Until then, he wished the protagonist well. In the end, after a while, the protagonist came to the Marquis of Winterfell and asked if he began to trust her a little more. After increasing her dowry, she did deal with their debts. The man only looked at her uncertainly and asked how the girl knew what was going to happen, because she could not see the future. But she calmly said that it was because when she was in the south, she had accidentally seen reports from the head of the lands in her father's office and had assumed that the plague would soon spread throughout the kingdom. But the protagonist calmly said that as a child she had a maid who looked after her, who before she became her servant led a nomadic life. And every night the girl always told her life instead of stories. So one day she informed the protagonist that the herb prickly vines can help with a deadly disease when fever grips the entire body. After saying all this, Nadia smiled happily and thought that it was all an absolute lie, because she had never known such a maid and had learned about the medicinal properties of the herb from her past life. At this point, after looking at the main character carefully, Glenn gave up and apologized to her for misunderstanding her, but she only smiled happily and thanked him for his apology. Then, looking seriously at the girl, the Marquis said that when she said she was going to pay off all her debts after she earned the money, he originally thought she was lying, but the protagonist only wondered if such an opinion was due to the fact that her father was a duke. When Glenn heard about it, he confessed that the reasons for such thoughts were indeed in her bloodline and asked why she continued to help them. If her father found out about it, he would not like it. But the protagonist pretended to be madly surprised and wondered how Glenn had listened to her all this time, since she'd already told him her true intentions several times. And then, with the sweetest possible expression on her face, said that it was because she really loved him and wondered if he'd forgotten when she told him that. But when Glenn heard about it, he felt a crazy discontent and then thought about the fact that the girl cannot stop talking about her love, but still said that whatever the real reason for Nadia, but she still paid the debts of Winterfell, so if she had any request to him, he will definitely fulfill it. When the protagonist heard about it, she was madly surprised because she didn't even expect him to suggest such a thing. But she was madly sad that she couldn't tell Winterfell that he should just listen to her more because he wouldn't understand what she meant. So Nadia took the path of least resistance and smiled happily and said that her request was that Glenn hug her at least once. He was madly surprised, but the protagonist only apologized and said that it was probably too difficult to request and apologized. But when Marcus heard this, he looked at Nadia calmly and said that he had not expected such a request, because he was sure that she had another wish, and suggested that she might ask him to punish the gossiping maids or ask him to return the money she had spent. But when the protagonist heard this, she just exhaled tiredly and said that if she had asked for something like this, she would never have become a full member of the family, so it didn't make sense. After that, she came to the young man and hugged him and told him that such a reward was enough for her, and that it was also beneficial for the young man himself. So he gently held out his arms to the girl and took her in his embrace, and Nadia seemed madly surprised, for though she had asked for such a thing, she had not expected it. But in the next moment, the man excitedly thought about the fact that the smell of the girl was insanely pleasant, and he did not understand what she smells like, soap or perfume. But nevertheless, he pressed her tighter against him and thought that it did not matter because his wife really smelled insanely sweet. But in the end, the maid knocked in Glenn's office and told the Marquis that it was time for the business meeting, and the protagonist only excitedly thought that the maid had saved her because she was worried that she did not know how to stop hugging Glenn. Then she looked at the young man carefully and smiled and apologized for having to leave so soon, but he only looked at her calmly and wished her good luck. And then the protagonist began to leave, but at the last moment she decided to say a few words to him. So she turned to him and smiled happily and thanked the young man for granting her wish. Then she turned around and began to walk away, wondering if Glenn trusted her even a little more. In the end, When the protagonist entered the room, she asked how the accountants were doing. But they only madly reported that everything is really going well. Because, thanks to the method of double accounting which she taught them, now their work has become much easier. But then the excited traders asked what it meant, and then looking around the accounting department said that it was the first time they had heard of such a thing, because the girl had thought of dividing expenses and income into two parts, and now it would be much easier to track the movement of money. Then the excited man asked how Nadia had thought of such a method, but the protagonist only laughed and said that she had not thought of something like that at all, because she was not that smart, and she had learned it from a man who came from far away. Still looking at the papers, the traders said that they had no idea where this man could have come from, but he was really insanely incredible. At that moment, Nadia just bowed her head and smiled and agreed with these people, and then stated that the man who taught her all this really knew a lot. And then she remembered her conversation with Lord Ji-ho when they had a cup of tea and talked about the country from which he had come. And then the young man said that in the world in which he lived, women and men could receive the same education, and it was quite common. When Nadia heard this, she wondered if he was joking, because it was unbelievable to her that a woman could be trained on an equal footing with men. But Lord Ji-ho only smiled and said that he was telling the truth and that the woman was using the knowledge to start her own business. At that moment, Nadia lowered her head and thought about what she had said and said that she would also like to live such a life, because such a life really gives a lot of opportunities. But then, touching her hand to comfort her, the young man told the girl that she was indeed insanely clever, and he was terribly sorry that she had lived in her father's shadow all her life, but he wanted her to have a chance to discover her talent. Then, looking at Lord Ji-ho with admiration, the girl confessed that every time they met, the young man told her something new, and it was thanks to him that she was able to learn to think bigger. Then, looking over the double-entry bookkeeping sheets, Nadia admitted that it helped her immensely when she went back in time and started making plans. But afterward, she sadly thought that despite all that they had in common, Lord Ji-ho had just abandoned her to get a higher position. But at that moment, she was approached by a merchant who took her out of her thoughts and asked if she was all right. Then the man said that Mrs. Sherlock had better be careful with Sherlock because he was very cunning and greedy for money, so he would not give up for nothing. But the protagonist just laughed and calmed them down and said that people really shouldn't worry about it because they knew very well who her father hated the most, namely those who didn't pay taxes on time. And that was much worse. And at that moment, the disgruntled father of the protagonist ordered his servant to start a tax audit against the merchants in the north right away, and he ordered his servant to find all the dirt on them. He bowed accordingly and left the room. And at that moment, clenching his fist in anger, the Duke didn't understand how it had all happened in such a way. After all, when he had allowed his daughter to use her dowry for her foolish business, he had no idea that she could succeed so much. And then he thought that something was wrong and that such success could not be a mere coincidence. And he thought that perhaps Nadia had betrayed them. But after he calmed down, he decided that this really couldn't be possible. After all, the girl really couldn't have known about the disease and the cure before he knew about it. And besides, to know about it so early to have time to come up with such a plan. So the girl was just lucky this time. And such events were really a happy accident. Then he grudgingly crumpled up her letter and thought about the fact that nothing will last forever, and the Winterfell budget will be at the bottom again. In the end, after a while, the protagonist, together with the butler and her assistant Fabian, finished arranging and restoring their estate. And then the girl rather reported that there seemed to be no more places that should have been repaired. And the butler tearfully confessed to the girl that he had never expected that he would ever be able to see something like this, because all this was possible only thanks to Nadia's business. And he was extremely grateful that she not only paid off the debt, but also decided to deal with all the problems of the house. But the protagonist only smiled happily at this reaction from the man and said that it was now not only their mansion but also hers, and she was delighted that the place where they could all live had become much brighter. She thought she could finally get some rest. Then she looked at the butler and Fabian and told the men that she would like to go to her office and do some work, and they happily agreed. And seeing their happy faces, Nadia thought that for a while she had really had a hard time. But now that she had done what she had to do, she felt much better and more confident and literally glowing with happiness. But then before she left, she went to the butler and said she had something for him. Then giving him a bag of money, said that it was his reward for being the best butler, since he had put an insane amount of effort into building a household that didn't exist. The butler only said that it was too huge a sum for him and that the girl had better save it for the future. But the protagonist only smilingly looked at him and said that all this time their lands had existed only thanks to the hard work of the servants, and therefore every effort deserved a worthy reward. Then, literally glowing and looking at the man with joyful eyes, said that the butler must have often been uncomfortable in front of his subordinates because of salary problems. So now he will be able to maintain his authority and compensate them for it. After hearing something like that, the butler literally couldn't stand it and cried with happiness and confessed that he used to think that everything around him was falling apart. The annual wave of monsters, as well as the gradual problems with food due to the lack of crops, and the problems of the mansion due to the increase in expenses. But now he could solve it all so easily that he fell on his knees before the lady. He tearfully told her that the girl was a miracle that had been sent to them by their ancestors and confessed that he would honor and care for her all his life. After seeing the man's reaction, the protagonist only smiled awkwardly and thanked him for it. Then she thought that she had not expected that because of such a small act, the butler would become so loyal to her. At that moment, an agitated Fabian began to lift the butler from his knees and excitedly asked him to stop crying. The butler could not recover from Nadia's touching act. And looking at the two men, the girl admitted to herself that her successful business had made the servants trust her. Then she looked out of the window and thought that she must keep moving at the same pace to complete her plan. But suddenly she noticed that outside the window there was a knight on horseback carrying a red flag. That the red flag meant it was an urgent message. But the girl just wondered why. If it was urgent, he felt so calm and wondered if he had any idea what had happened. He only frantically excited and awkwardly began to stammer, but after gathering himself said that the red flag at this time means that there is a high probability that the Count has crossed their border. Then the protagonist remembered that the county was south of Winterfell, and this territory was not part of the Northern Commonwealth, nor of the alliance of the protagonist's father. He was a third party to the conflict. Thinking about it, Nadia wondered if relations between neighboring territories might be bad. But judging by the reaction of the butler and Fabian, they were obviously hiding something. So excitedly, she looked them over and wondered if they meant that the county crossed their territory every year. But when she saw their shocked faces, the protagonist was horrified to realize she was right. She had no money or resources in Winterfell, and it had crazy neighbors, and she didn't know what to do about it. So she leaned against the door in tears to keep from falling. She realized that if the butler and Fabian still hadn't answered, it meant something terrible. So in order to get answers to her questions, she went straight to her husband and said that she had heard the news earlier and said that their property was being encroached upon by neighbors. But Glenn calmly said that this sometimes happens and that Nadia should not worry because he would be back soon. But it seems that with such words, Nadia was clearly displeased, then thought about the fact that it would be strange if she didn't worry when her husband goes off to war. So it was a completely normal reaction and tried to convince himself of that. But at that moment, Fabian turned to Nadia and told her that she needn't worry, for Winterfell's army was the strongest in the north, or even in the whole kingdom. Then looking at the Lord, he said that their Lord was the strongest warrior in the whole empire, and the low-grade soldiers of the county could not be their rivals. But Glenn only looked at Fabian and asked him to shut up as soon as possible. She did seem to feel a little calmer, and then she thought that when she saw Fabian so sure of himself, she believed that there was really nothing to worry about. Then she smiled and thought about the fact that in that case, she should have already thought of the best territories to take from their enemies. But suddenly her joy was replaced by confusion, and she thought about the fact that if Winterfell was always winning, she didn't understand where the lands were conquered. After all, Winterfell had no other possessions besides the northern territories. So she turned to Fabian and asked how often there had been wars with this county. And Fabian calmly said that such battles on the battlefield were quite common. And at that moment, Nadia looked at him carefully and asked him why they had not taken any part of the earth away from them despite the huge number of chances. Fabian was silent for a moment, but Glenn calmly entered the conversation and said it was all about the fortress. They win on the battlefield, but as soon as the enemy troops feel threatened, they hide in the fortress. The protagonist only scrutinized him and wondered what fortress was in question. Then she thought that she had heard of something like this before. But then Fabian spoke up and agreed with Glenn that their opponents were indeed insanely mean. Then he said that as much as he didn't want to admit it, the fortress they owned was called the Celestial Palace. And when the troops hid there, they could do absolutely nothing. And so because the soldiers never came out of there, they surrendered and returned. Then Fabian noticed with some sadness that most of the soldiers in the county were mercenaries. But even that didn't bother them at all. But they can't turn a blind eye to the fact that they are holding their citizens hostage. And these were the people who should have been farming and living a peaceful life. When Nadia heard such a story, she immediately thought that she could finally remember which fortress she was talking about. This fortress is known for being near a rich source of iron ore. And if that's the case, then with some help they can capture it without any problems, and then they will be able to take the source of ore. Then she remembered that there was a dragon to be found near that place, and that in the past the appearance of the dragon had been a disaster. But this time everything is completely different, as the dragon has long since left the world of the living, but left behind a huge treasure trove of treasures. So with a determined fist, the protagonist decided that she just cannot look at what is happening and the citizens who were constantly attacked. But they themselves gave a reason to conquer these lands, so she is not going to give up so easily. But at that moment, distracting everyone from thinking and pondering, one of the knights entered the room, who turned to Glenn and told the gentleman that it was time for them to leave. Looking at such a confident Glenn, Nadia thought that the man looked like he was going to have fun, not to war, but her husband was really an unusual man. So she looked at him sincerely worried and asked him to be as careful as possible and to come home soon. He only looked at her coldly and calmly agreed, and then turned around and walked away. As he walked down the corridor, the knight told Glenn that apparently his relationship with his wife wasn't as bad as he had expected. Glenn only coldly asked why he thought so. But the knight only calmly looked at Glenn and said that anyone would have thought so in his place. Then warned that the Marquis really should not have trusted this girl, and said that he realized that a beautiful, fragile girl who says nice things to him is really quite nice. So it would be strange if Glenn hadn't started to feel something for her in the meantime, but he shouldn't have given her his heart because he knew the reason. Glenn calmly said that he understood the reason, but that Nadia had paid their family's debts and therefore he could not be rude to her. Then he said that in fact he did not trust this girl either. After hearing this, the knight said that in this case, he should not have worried. Glenn and his knight were at the Winterfell camp a few days later discussing the plan for the takeover, at which point the knight said that so far everything was going as they had suggested, and they had closed in on the fortress, so he asked if they should call the army back. Glenn only thoughtfully looked at the map and did not even know what to do. Seeing such thoughtfulness on the part of the Marquis knight, said that they can try to take the fortress, and if the Count's army suffered on the battlefield, they will need time to fully recover their numbers. Glenn looked carefully at the map in front of him and weighed the pros and cons, and mentally stated that he also wanted to do it so badly, but there were reasons why he couldn't. So he looked at the knight and said that they should not do it because he did not want to risk the lives of his soldiers in the battle because the probability of failure would be quite high. But the next moment they were distracted by a noise from the street, so the excited men immediately turned their heads to see why it was so noisy. And at that moment there was the excited voice of the guards explaining to someone that a man could not pass through. Then the knight, leaving the table, said that since it was noisy outside, he would go and check what was going on there. But Glenn calmly said that there was no need for that as he had a desire to go for a walk anyway, so he asked him to rest in peace. And when the man started to approach the door, he heard that the knights were accusing the comer of putting them in a difficult situation. But the comer strongly asked them to let him in at least for a while. And finally, when Glenn opened the curtain, he was thrilled to find Nadia in front of it, accompanied by Fabian and several other knights, and he didn't understand what the girl was doing here. And she calmly took off her hood and said hello to her husband and stated that it had been a long time since they'd seen each other. That she said she really missed him, but he only wondered why she was here, But the girl didn't seem to notice and said she was glad Glenn was okay, and she was relieved. In the end, Glenn, carefully looking at his wife in front of him, did not understand her behavior. After all, she had just a couple of days ago wished him a happy road, and the war was going according to plan, so he was already planning to return home. And so he had no idea what was going on in the head of the protagonist. And then, remembering her last words, he literally couldn't believe that a girl could actually care about him, because it seemed unbelievable. But after seeing her smiling face, the man exhaled and admitted to himself that this was definitely not something to worry about. Then, going inside to the place where Glenn was now temporarily residing, he told his wife that they needed to go inside and talk. Finally, the protagonist sitting at the table said that she had already written the military request. Glenn was shocked and asked what Nadia was doing and why she was doing it, but looking at his shocked face, the girl calmly said that she had found a way to take over the fortress, and she thought no one believed it, so she had to write a formal appeal. Glenn looked at her carefully and realized that he was basically right, that the girl hadn't come here because she was worried about him. But afterwards, he was angry at himself for having already rejoiced and mad at himself for even thinking of such a thing. And then he asked if Nadia understood what a military request meant in wartime. But she coldly and calmly informed me that the penalty for false reporting was the death penalty, and that she knew everything. Then she looked resolutely in front of her and thought that she wasn't bothered by the punishment because she had told the truth. So absolutely nothing bad had happened. But at that moment, the knight looked at her and said that looking at the girl's confidence, it seemed that this method would bring her victory. So he said that they could consider this plan and see how good it was. Eventually, excited by the opportunity, the protagonist resolutely rose above the map and said that in that case she could start. After that, she started pointing to different places on the map and said that they should build a mountain in the west near the fortress. But in the north, they had to choose a cave, and the mountain would be the trap. So it had to be built to the end, because the most important thing was the cave. Then the girl said that they should put a lot of gunpowder and oil under the ground and set it on fire. And when the cave collapses, the fortress will fall with it, and then they will be able to capture the enemies. After hearing all this, the knight thought that in a situation where they had absolutely no idea how to take the fortress, a cave sounded like a perfectly good option. Glenn then approached the map and excitedly started looking at the places where the girl was pointing, and said that they hadn't even guessed about this decision before, but then said that there were a lot of granite rocks in the area, and they had already checked the area. But the girl only smiled and looked at him and said that it was absolutely nothing to worry about, because she had seen in her father's office information about the weakness of the fortress, and it said that there were many soft rocks in the north of the fortress, so there would be no problems. Then think about it. Glenn admitted that the problem with the fortress had been a headache for his ancestors, and if they just backed off now, the conflict would reappear someday, and the problem of conquering the fortress would arise. At this point, the girl turned to Glenn and told him that she could rely on her father's materials, which he had collected in case someone became his enemy. When the knight heard this, he calmly said that the Duke must have plenty of such papers. But then he looked at the girl seriously and wondered if she was the Duke's daughter, and then he realized that he didn't like anything about the girl. But at that moment, Glenn stood up for her and looked at the Lord carefully and said that the problem with the fortress had probably bored him as much as Glenn himself, and that if Nadia was telling the truth, then this was their chance to take. So after looking at the man carefully, he said that he should send people to the north, because it wouldn't be so hard to check if it was true that there were a lot of soft rocks up there. At this point, Glenn looked at the protagonist and said that since the girl was really willing to put her life on the line, he was sure she wasn't deceiving him. At that moment, the main character literally glowed with happiness and looked like a little puppy. She was madly happy that her husband trusted her. Then she thought that Glenn was absolutely right, because she really wanted to help them. But seeing Nadia's reaction, Glenn only grudgingly thought he didn't know what she was talking about. He didn't mean to say he trusted her, nor did he mean it. But at that moment, the girl grabbed his arm and looked at him carefully, asking Glenn to take care of himself, and if it would make him feel better, let him think that she was only telling the truth because she was facing the death penalty. But in the end, after some more time, the agitated lord, looking at the picture of destruction all around, literally couldn't believe that the protagonist wasn't lying, because the fortress was really starting to crumble before his eyes. So he ordered his soldiers to start storming the building with determination. And finally, after several hours, they broke into the fortress and saw the count scared to death, shaking with fear and asking not to be approached. Then he reminded him that he had already repeatedly said that he was surrendering. Then he looked closely at the Marquis of Winterfell and said that he had absolutely no knowledge of aristocratic pride. And even if he was his prisoner, he was still a nobleman, so he should follow the aristocratic laws. But after looking at him with great hatred, the Marquis informed him that he had absolutely no right to talk about pride and laws, since he kept attacking their territory, and not even 6 months had passed before he attacked them. And the soldiers who had previously sacrificed themselves for the kingdom were forced to go into battle again. And the Earl didn't even think his men should have rested and declared war. But the aristocrat, who was shaking with fear, only said that the Marquis could not do anything to him even in such a case because he was still a nobleman. At that moment, the voice of the protagonist, who smiled, told Glenn that the Count was absolutely right in what he was saying, because although her husband had won the war, he could not take this man's life. So she approached him and smiled at him and offered him another option to resolve the situation. Then, with an intimidating and contemptuous smile looking at the Count, said that when he lost and was captured, he simply could not stand such humiliation and therefore committed suicide because of great shame, and then kindly said that this is the only way to preserve the pride of an aristocrat. The man was really shocked when he heard about it and literally did not understand who this crazy girl was, because at this rate, and with such people that surround him, he could really soon die, but already with fear. So he knelt down in front of Glenn and Nadia and begged them for mercy, and promised that if they would let him live, he would give them all his wealth. But at this moment, it was as if the girl knew of such words, so she held out a contract to him and informed him that this contract was a non-aggression pact, and if the Count signed it, they would save his life. Finally, he excitedly took the paper and began to read what was written there, and the contract stated that firstly, the Earl that for 30 years will not attack the land in Winterfell, and secondly, the county as the losing party will pay 100,000 gold, and thirdly, the county will transfer all rights to the Rhine lands, including the fortress. He tried to object, but then Nadia towered over him and told him not to even think about discussing the points. Then, smiling sweetly at her armed husband's guard, the girl said that the Count should not sit like that and just look at them, because it would be better for him to sign the contract as soon as possible. In the end, and after a successful operation, all the knights were insanely happy that they had finally captured the fortress and forced them to surrender, so they drank happily. Eventually, one of the knights spoke to his friend and told him that he felt a lot better when they finally resolved this long-running turf war, and he just laughed and agreed. Then they started talking about how it was worth it to see the look on the Count's face when Nadia got the treaty, because he had no idea that a loophole could be found in the Highlands. After that, they began to wonder whether the lady really was able to figure it out on her own. Also at the table sat Glenn, who drinking thought about the fact that with the appearance of Nadia in his life, she really began to help him a lot. And first she took care of their debts, and now even was able to ensure their victory in the war. So the girl really helped them in everything. Then he confessed that he had originally thought that the girl had only gotten close to him because she had been sent to spy on him, but she turned out to be something else entirely. At that moment, Glenn did not find the girl and asked Fabian, who was her personal guard, what had happened and where his wife was. But he calmly said that the girl had said she was tired and wanted to rest at her place. At this point, the protagonist sitting at her desk over a piece of paper didn't understand how she could discreetly hint to Glenn about finding the dragon, and then she started going over her options. And the first option is that she could say she happened to be passing by and found the cave. And the second option was that an ancestor came to her in a dream and told her about it. But neither of those options looked impressive enough. But then there was a knock on the main character's door, and she turned around and hesitantly thought that she had already warned everyone that she was going on vacation, so she didn't understand who could come to her. At that moment, a young man appeared in her doorway, who looked at her carefully and didn't know what to say. But at that moment, the protagonist saved him from embarrassment and took the initiative to ask him why he had come, because she was sure that they were all celebrating, and so she wondered what had brought the young man here. But he calmly and somehow more friendly looking at Nadia said that it was thanks to her that they were able to win, and it would be better if she was now with all the soldiers. The girl only agreed, thinking about his proposal, and at that moment the young man offered himself as an escort, and Nadia did not understand why he would do such a thing, for he had never behaved so courteously before. As they walked down the corridors, Glenn stated that he had heard from her personal guard that she was tired and wanted to go back to her room, but it seemed to him that she wasn't asleep at all. At this time, the girl only smiled happily and realized what she was talking about and said that she couldn't really sleep because she was thinking about the new territories and the fact that they had finally gotten them. And of course, she had to think about how to use them. And she was especially worried about the mine because the production of iron ore would increase. But the next moment the girl stumbled carelessly and then almost fell. But she was picked up by Glenn with trembling hands who did not let her fall. The still excited protagonist awkwardly thanked him and said she was too relaxed to worry about his safety. She thought it was totally unexpected that she had suddenly twisted her leg, but then she thought about the fact that she was much more concerned that Glenn's space was now too close to hers. The next moment he did so and asked her to be more careful in the future. And the protagonist only thought that her husband was acting strangely, because initially he offered to see her off, and now he began to get closer. When they entered the room, they saw the soldiers drinking and partying, celebrating their victory. As they entered, Nadia realized that the place was noisy, as if she were in a marketplace. But at that moment, the knights, delighted by her appearance, literally glowed, madly rejoicing that the lady had visited them, and asked why she had just arrived. And the girl only smiled happily and waved her hand at them, but she awkwardly thought that she realized that all the knights would be drunk, so she didn't want to come because she felt awkward in such a company, but still she should have welcomed the military that did their job so well. But at that moment, Glenn turned to her awkwardly, looking at her carefully, and said that their reaction was due to their mad joy at the end of the protracted war, so he asked Nadia to understand why they were behaving like that. But the next moment the Lord came up to her and looked at her carefully and told her that he had something to tell her. The girl was madly surprised and thought that it was just in time, because she wanted to point out to them some finding. But in the next moment, kneeling in front of the girl, the Lord apologized to her for previously doubting her. And Nadia, watching all this, literally could not believe it and absolutely did not expect this. So she asked the Lord to get up quickly, because she knew exactly why he didn't trust her, because he had already told her the reason, and it was that she was from the Duke's family. Then she looked more sternly at the Lord and told him that she had nothing more to do with that family, and that her reputation was also her husband's, and that his bad behavior toward her was tantamount to ruining the reputation of the head of the family he served. But at that moment, Glenn turned to her and told her that Lord had behaved in such a way because of his deep loyalty to their family, because he was an insanely cautious man, and said that it would not happen again. But the protagonist calmly looked at him and said that she would not assert her authority only at the expense of others, so she herself should give him a decent punishment. At that moment, the still-bowed man proudly announced that he was ready to receive him, and he was well aware of how rude he had been to the lady earlier. Then Nadia looked at him seriously and said that such a punishment would be hard for him to bear alone. However, if he shared the burden, it would not be so hard for him. The rest of the knights had no idea what was going on, because the voice of the protagonist was indeed insanely sinister, and they couldn't even believe that their mistress was such a person. But then the girl smilingly informed that absolutely every one of the knights must be punished, and so they are all without exception obliged to drink a fine portion of liquor. After hearing this, all the knights would have been madly surprised because they had already expected something worse. But in the end, they just laughed and said that their mistress was indeed a joker, and seemed to be madly pleased that they were not mistaken and the girl was indeed madly kind. But the next moment she only smiled happily and said that she was pleased that her punishment had pleased the knights, and asked the maid to bring them what she had previously asked. And finally, the maids brought them barrels and began to fill them to serve the knights. But their glasses looked more like bathtubs, and the excited knights were no longer so enthusiastic about this, so they asked if the lady thought it was too much. After that, looking at her smiling face, they said that in addition, all that she offered them to drink was vodka, but she only happily said that the penalty dose should be just that, and told the commander that she would pour it personally. When the protagonist poured the Lord his drink, but he only thought that all the knights took the situation as a joke. But it was completely different because Nadia pointing out his rudeness attracted the attention of the soldiers. Moreover, she makes everyone remember that she was above them. So that the protagonist was evidently so simple, and perhaps there really was a nobleman in the north. With these thoughts, he began to drink his fine glass. As a result, the other knights took the initiative that Lord showed them, and so happily began to call themselves next in order to drink, after which they began to argue about who would be honored first. The protagonist only happily watched this whole picture and asked them not to argue about such a thing, because they all have absolutely enough to drink. Looking after such a protagonist at this moment, Glenn smiled for the first time and seemed to be perfectly happy with her behavior, and he even found it cute. In the end, in the same night, while all the knights were resting, the main character secretly snuck into the fortress and put her lantern on the table and began to falsify documents. Anne thought that for such a deed, she'd just have to thank absolutely everyone, and even the ancestors, because she came up with the perfect idea. So the next day, when the knights together with her husband looked around the office of the former count, the protagonist loudly revealed that this document, which she found on the table, spoke of a fight. All immediately turned excitedly and wondered what she was talking about and wondered if they had received these lands, but there was a similar disaster. But Glenn only calmly exhaled and said that everything was going really crazy suspiciously smoothly. But then he said that even because of the dragon, they just couldn't get rid of the land so easily. But at this point, the protagonist, excitedly reading the document, said that they had nothing to worry about because it said that the master of the dragon had long since died. And so the count had just received the report and had not yet had time to start digging, so all the rare items accumulated by the dragon were now theirs. When Glenn heard that, he was out of his mind and really couldn't believe what was happening. Then he thought to himself that he didn't understand why things had gotten so good, because it couldn't have been luck. I mean, he'd never been lucky. At that moment, the protagonist looked at him and thought that apparently the guy still couldn't believe in such a big fortune. But after praising herself, she realized that this whole situation was possible only because of her. But at that moment, excitedly looking at the letter, young man asked how the protagonist was able to read it, because no matter how much he tried, he could not do it. Then ran up to him. Excited knight said that he also saw the letter, but left it because he absolutely did not understand such a terrible handwriting of the count. At this point, the protagonist was shocked to realize that even though she had written with her left hand, she had not expected it to seem so incomprehensible to the rest of the world. And it was probably for this reason that no one had said anything about the land during the 4 days of the search. But then she waved her hands in the air in excitement and said that her father had similar handwriting, and that she was accustomed to recognizing such letters from childhood. Then she suggested that they should go on a search and assemble a search party, for it would be better to find out the extent of what was going on before returning to Winterfell. When he heard this, the young man lowered his gaze and thought that Nadia had a lot of different ones that he didn't even know about.